The Human from a Dungeon by its director. Chapter 1. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level, Not Applicable, Human, American. So, what do you suppose it is? I don't know, it looks kinda like an elf. But the ears are weirdly round and it has body hair. Yeah, can't be an elf. Maybe it's a tall dwarf. No, not enough body hair to be dwarven. Plus, I've never heard of a dwarf over 4 feet tall. Yeah, me neither. Don't they all have beards? Pretty sure. These voices sounded strange to me, like they're speaking my language, but in a weird accent or something. And the voices were heavy? No, that's not the term. Rumbling. Why is it so hard to think? A gnome. No, gnomes are just short elves. It could be some sort of weird pig kobold thing. Oh yeah, wait. That still doesn't explain the round ears. Plus, the face is all wrong. Look, the nose is too pointy. Am I asleep? Dreaming? What are they talking about? The last thing I remember was going to the hospital to see my girlfriend. Did I get hurt along the way? Are these people doctors? I'm not in any pain, though. But I can't open my eyes. Why can't I open my eyes? What happened to me? I wonder if it can talk. Where'd you find this thing, anyway? You remember that wall collapse in the dungeon? My team and I were exploring that, and we got separated. Next thing I know, I find this thing on some sort of weird-looking table. It had a bunch of writing on it, but, well, you know. Yeah, you have trouble reading. That's all right. Go on. Right, well, I figured that I'd have a hell of a time trying to find my way back there, so I decided to take it with me. Once I picked it up, a lot of light started shining, and suddenly I was at the dungeon entrance. Teleportation. Yeah, probably. Huh, that's interesting. You know, since you found it in our dungeon, it might be an orc. Boisterous laughter. It reminds me of my old karate instructor. He used to laugh like that all the time, even when nobody was joking. I wonder what happened to him. I wonder what happened to me. I think I visited my girlfriend, the love of my life, Cassandra. She wasn't in pain today, but the cancer's getting worse. Her formerly luscious blonde hair that went all the way down to her waist was now patchy and wiry from the chemo. Her stunning blue eyes still had their kindness and humor, but betrayed the pain that she was desperately trying to hide. She looked kind of like a skeleton with skin now, but she joked that maybe she can finally be a model. She's still my Cass. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, then I started to head home. I had to study, because even with everything going on, they were still making me take finals. The bastards know that Cass is sick, but they don't care. State requirements for graduation or whatever. Pisses me off. Fuck them, I want to drop out and get a job. But Cass won't hear of it. Neither will Mom. Dad understands and says he'd do the same, but he'd like me to respect the wishes of Mom and Cass. How am I supposed to study with the thought of losing her looming over my head, though? How can I think of anything else? There's no way this thing's an orc. It's too small. Plus the ears. Yeah, I feel like you're hyper-fixated on the ears. Hyper-what now? Fixated. You're focusing too much on the ears. Well, they're weird, though. Have you ever heard of anything that has round ears? Not off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's something. After all, we're looking at round ears right now. Round ears? What does that have to do with anything? Whatever, nothing to do with me. What happened after I started to walk home? I stopped by a gas station and grabbed some chips and a soda to lighten my spirits, and the last thing I remember is crossing the street. There were horns and screeching, and then huge lights. Pain. I felt pain all over my body. And then nothing. Did I get hit by a truck? I wish we could ask it what it is. Well, I could cast healing magic on it, see if that wakes it up. You think Chief would be okay with that? He'll probably want to see it first, right? I won't tell if you don't. We'll just say that it woke up on its own. All right, deal. Awesome. Keep a hand on your axe, just in case. Ready? Leironim Tsak. A pleasant warmth began to spread throughout my body, like getting a massage from a million fingers all at once. My grogginess began to ebb, and I opened my eyes. Things were blurry at first, but I was soon able to focus on the wooden ceiling. I don't know this ceiling. Wait, wooden ceiling? What kind of building has a wooden ceiling? A barn. I sat up and looked around. The furniture in the room looked like it came straight out of a medieval movie, but a bad one that didn't pay attention to details. I was on a bed with woven sheets and a blanket, for one thing. For another, there were metal handles on some of the furniture. That wasn't a thing in medieval times, right? Then the two people who were talking earlier caught my eye. Cosplayers? How'd they manage to look so big? One was wearing metallic armored pants and no top, showing off its rippling muscles. It looked as if it was scared of me, and it was holding a large serrated axe at its side. The other one was wearing a robe and carrying a staff with some sort of metal ball at the top. All of these details about their appearances were striking, but the most striking thing was that they were both green. Green, pointy ears and huge. Even hunched over, the robed one with the staff was probably 6 and 5. The one with the axe was pushing 6 to 10. The one with the staff grinned and showed a mouth full of very pointy teeth, like an alligator's. "Whoa, careful there, you just woke up. Don't want you falling over," it said. The words sounded weird, as if I weren't hearing them right. No, that's not it. The mouth movements are weird. It's like they're saying something else, but it's dubbed over, with a hint of the original audio left in. "Where am I? Who are you? What are you?" I asked, trying not to panic. My mouth felt weird when I spoke, like I'm saying the words that I'm saying, but my mouth was moving differently, like trying to make a t sound, but making a k sound instead. There was something else that was strange as well, but I couldn't figure it out. "I'm Yulk," the grinning one said. "This is my brother Nash. We're orcs." "Yep, nice to meet you. You're in Nulava, a temporary orc settlement that's right outside of the Delver's dungeon. We're hoping to make it a village someday," Nash said, taking his hand off his axe and crossing his arms. "Orc-ta?" I asked, getting used to the weird talking. "Yes," Yulk said, "we're orcs. Now that we've answered your questions, I'd like to ask you one." "Ask me a question," I asked. What are you?" Nash interrupted impatiently. I sat stunned for a moment. "Orcs are real, and what do they mean? What am I?" I looked at my hands, the same ones I've always had, even with the same scar I got as a kid, though the scar was looking a bit smaller now. I noticed I didn't have my shirt on, and I quickly checked under the blanket. Yep, naked. Weird. All of this is weird. What the hell is going on? Nash cleared his throat, patiently waiting for me to answer his question. "I'm a human, and my name's Nick. Short for Nicodemus. Nicodemus Liam Smith," I stammered as I pulled the blanket up a little bit more. The two orcs shared a confused glance at each other before looking back to me. What's there to be confused about? Sure, Nicodemus is kind of a rare name, but it's not that rare. Hell, I used to get picked on for it all the time. The secret of NIMH is single-handedly the reason that I go by Nick. Yulk turned back to me and asked, "What's a human?" "Huh? What?" I asked. "I've never heard of a human before," Nash said, scratching his head. "What were you doing locked away in the dungeon?" "What dungeon? What do you mean you've never heard of a human?" I asked. "Okay, wait," Yulk said. "Let's try not to make assumptions here. Let's start at the beginning and get on the same page. Nick, you're a human. We don't know what that is. Nash here found you in a secret room inside the Delver's dungeon. You don't know how you got there?" "No, the last thing I remember was walking home and—" I trailed off. "Oh, right. What?" "I think I got hit by a truck." "What's a truck?" Nash asked. "It's like a wagon or something that doesn't need anything to pull it," I said. "Oh, we've got those," Nash said. "Right, Yulk?" "Yes, we call them magic carts, but I suspect that they're not the same thing." "Magi... carts? Carts pulled with magic, doesn't her?" I asked. "Yep," both orcs replied in unison. Wait. Orcs, magic, dungeons, getting hit by a truck. Did I get isekai'd? Or is this just a hallucination that my dying brain is showing me to protect me from the trauma of getting hit by a truck? I suppose there's nothing I can do about this being a hallucination, so I have to go off the assumption that it's not. Which means finding a way back. Wait, if I got reincarnated or whatever to this place, then maybe Cass did as well. Have you seen any other things like me? I asked. Like others in the dungeon? Any females? They usually have long hair and larger breasts. Oh, so you're a male human? Yulk asked. I kinda guessed, but didn't want to be presumptuous. No, like I said earlier, we haven't seen anything like you before, Nash said. Then he leaned closer to Yulk and asked quietly, What's presumptuous mean? It means not being able to observe what's appropriate or permitted in a social setting, Yulk whispered back. Meanwhile, I was trying not to lose it. Cass is terminally ill with cancer, and I wasn't going to be there for her when she passed. I clenched my jaw and stared at the ceiling as I fought back tears. It's not fair. She doesn't deserve to be alone, and I promised her that I'd be by her side until the end. I take it that all this comes as a bit of a shock, Yulk said softly. Yeah, it does, I replied. All right, well, we'll let you process things. We've got to go tell the chief you're up. And then get yelled at for waking you up, Nash said. We'll send someone in with food and drink in a bit. Wait, I said, where do I go to defecate? Nash looked surprised and then pointed to the door opposite the one he and his brother were next to. That's the bathroom. Pull the handle to flush the toilet. Okay, I said, wiping my eyes. The two orcs left the room. Indoor plumbing was unexpected, but I suppose I shouldn't be entirely surprised. There's magic here, and there's no telling what that magic can do. Maybe it can return me to my world in time to be with Cass again, so that I can say goodbye. Or maybe even save her. I owe it to her to try, at least. She's made me happier than any man has a right to be. The room started spinning a little bit, so I laid back down. How did I go from getting hit by a truck to being asleep in a dungeon anyway? And when you get isekai'd, don't you normally get to talk to a sexy goddess or a pervy old god? Some exposition would have been nice. It finally hit me what else felt weird about this place: the air. It smelt different, tasted weird, and was hotter than it should be, but all of these things weren't necessarily strange. You would get that just by going to a different city. No, what was strange was how it felt on my skin. A tingle that felt like it should be giving me goosebumps, but wasn't. Very odd. The door to the room opened, and a short orc, still about 5'9" inches or so, entered holding a plate full of meat with a cup of something on it. Her green skin was slightly paler than the other two orcs, and she had an air of grace surrounding her that defied expectations. Like meeting a princess in a bandit camp. What she was wearing definitely wasn't something that royalty would wear, though. It was an outfit that left little to the imagination. A skin-tight bikini top and very short shorts that exaggerated her ample curves. I tried not to stare, but noticed she was trembling and trying not to look at me as she set the platter down on a table next to my bed. Then she quickly turned and almost ran out of the room. Weird, I said under my breath. I looked at the plate of meat. I guess this confirms that the orcs are carnivorous. I figured that was the case based on the teeth, though. Going to be hard to deal with a meat-only diet, since I'm not a fan of liver. At least they cook it. Would these guys farm? Maybe for trade or to feed their domesticated animals. I'll have to ask. I took a bite from one of the brown pieces of meat. The tart, metallic taste made me grimace a bit. Liver. A necessity for omnivores on a meat-only diet, though. As I chewed the gamey meat, I found myself hoping desperately that they had wild orange trees or something nearby. The white meat was far more palatable, though. It tastes similar to chicken, but not quite, like a juicier version of quail. I washed it down with the liquid in the cup, plain old water, but it felt more refreshing than anything I've ever had. I wondered how long I had been unconscious in that dungeon they mentioned. Hopefully not long. I don't even know if time works the same here as it did on my world. There's too much I don't know. I finished the food and suddenly realized how weak and tired I felt. Like I had been running around carrying heavy stuff all day. I was afraid to go back to sleep at first, but then I thought that if I go to sleep, maybe I'll wake up in a proper hospital bed back in my world. Maybe this is just a dream. Maybe I'll be able to see Cass again. I'll do anything to see her again. Chapter 2. Nash Alta Adventurer Level 8. Orc Nullavan. So you two woke it up? Chief Gluhern shouted. No, sir, I lied. We were simply guessing at what he could be when he woke up all on his own. Yulk lied. We had a short discussion with him, had Catalina grab him some food, and came immediately here to inform you, sir. The chief eyed us suspiciously. He knows we're lying, but he also knows that he can't prove it. Yulk and I will cover each other until our dying breath, and it's not like the human can tell on us. If the chief can't prove it, he can't openly punish us without people getting mad about injustice. Then he'll have to listen to speech after speech after speech, a much worse punishment than whatever he'd give us, which means that he'll probably resort to underhanded punishments. I fully expect to be voluntold to do some extra chores this week. A shame, Yulk and I really wanted to go back into the dungeon and look for clues about the human. Maybe we should have left it alone after all. Smells like bullshit to me, but I'm assuming there's no witnesses, Gluhern said as he looked around. After a few shaken heads, he turned back to us. There never are with you two. So it calls itself a human then? He, sir. And yes, he says he's a human. Not that it helps, Yulk said, dodging a thrown cup. Don't correct me, sorcerer, Gluhern shouted. Sir, did the others find anything related to the human? I asked, attempting to distract him from his rage. The chief drew a deep breath and said, Actually, no, your team still hasn't returned. We're sending a rescue party at sunrise. My blood ran cold. Bloon, Graz, Inoris and Rezgal were pretty tough guys. Almost as tough as me. Party wipes weren't exactly uncommon, but they don't happen to adventurers over level 5 very often. Those 4 are level 7, so they should be able to handle just about anything. What the hell's going on? I'd like to join the rescuers, I said. Me too, sir, Yulk added. I'm afraid not, Gluhern said, no longer angry. You're both under-leveled for the rescue party. Since they're over level 5, we're sending the over 10s. You'll be liabilities. I gnashed my teeth in frustration, but Chief isn't wrong. Reaching level 10 is an enormous accomplishment, and the difference in power between a level 9 and 10 is extreme. The downside to reaching that rank was all of the extra responsibility that came with it. Most over 10s go into mercenary work, leaving their homes behind. If they don't, they'll quickly get swamped with work that the other adventurers can't handle. Aren't they busy? Yulk asked. Alern and Kirisaka accomplished their task in the wastes, and they're back. Rirnu and Parkin haven't been doing much, as there aren't many wounded. 2 medics, a tank, and a rogue. The perfect rescue party, Gluhern replied with a grin. Parkin isn't a medic, she's a necromancer, I replied with distaste. That's just a late medic if you think about it, Yulk said cheerily. Plus, she knows combat magic as well. Yeah, well, she'd better be on time, I grumbled. Bloon owes me a drink, and zombies don't pay their debts. Do skeletons? Yulk asked. How the hell should I know? Well, how do you know that zombies don't then? Enough, shouted the chief. The matter of the rescue party is settled. The only matter I have left to discuss with you is your next task. Yulk and I stared at the grinning chief with stalwart expressions. We knew he wouldn't dare officially punish us, but there was a certain level of unease regarding the underhanded task he would give us. He won't be sending us into the dungeon. He knows we'll join the rescue party. There's a possibility that he'll send us into the wastes on retrieval duty, though. The damned herbs that go into medipotions love that sandy shithole. You'll guard the human until I say otherwise. 1 set of eyes on it at all times, Gluhern said, chuckling as my face fell. I'll leave it up to you to decide the shifts. If you wander off, I'll have your hides. Dibs on first shift, Yulk shouted unexpectedly. I turned to my brother and was shocked to see him nearly bouncing with excitement. Guard duty is the most boring task available, and just about any orc worth their salt will do anything to avoid it. I looked back to the chief, who shared my expression of shock. Why are you so excited? I asked. No reason, Yulk said, suddenly nervous. Let's go. He grabbed me and began dragging me out of the room, just as the chief was having second thoughts about our new assignment. I struggled a bit, but Yulk has a remarkably tight grip for a sorcerer. I watched the chief shrug as we left the room. What the hell's got into you? I asked as I finally shook his grip. Nash, we get to study the human, Yulk said, actually bouncing up and down this time. We might be the only ones who've ever met one. Okay, I said with a sigh. I see your point. It is kinda cool. I can't wait. I wonder if he has any magic resistances. That pink skin it has doesn't look like it's any tougher than ours. Be careful, brother, I cautioned. I wasn't able to tell if he heard my warning or not because he immediately started mumbling to himself and walking towards the hospital. I sighed as I followed after him. He'd always been like this. Something strikes his fancy, and he becomes unable to think of anything else until he's figured it out. Even if the chief hadn't tasked us with guard duty, Yulk probably would have ended up hanging around the human's room. "Hey, Nash, wait up," a familiar voice called out to me. I turned and saw a larger-than-life figure wearing full blackened plate armor and carrying a sword that was nearly as long as I am tall. I grabbed Yulk's arm to stop him from wandering off and nodded at the figure as it approached. "Hello, Alan. I hope the day finds you well. What can I do for you?" I asked him. "I wanted to ask you about the rescue mission," Alan replied. "Would you mind answering a few questions for us?" "Us?" I have apprised him of the likelihood that you know nothing other than what we've already been told, a voice said from behind me. I suppressed my urge to swing around. No need to. I already knew who it was. There isn't anyone else in the village that could sneak up on me, and he did so as often as he could. "Hello, Kirisaka," I said as I calmly turned to face him. Kirisaka is shorter than most orcs, but nobody has pointed that out to him since he was a child. There was a coldness in his eyes that would unnerve a drake. He's only a rogue in. The sense that he knows how to avoid traps and pass through locks. His specialty in combat is quick, silent movement and striking vital areas. With enough force to obliterate plate armor. The reason that everyone confuses his class is that he's the only shadow warrior in the village, and he doesn't bother correcting people who get it wrong. I glanced at his short swords. I prefer an axe, but I wouldn't complain if I had to use those babies. They were simple but elegant, double-edged with an exaggerated point and pommels designed after the sun and the moon. Kirisaka had received them as a reward for saving a wealthy elven family in the wastes. "How much?" I asked. "They are still not for sale. They shall never be for sale." "Stop asking," Kirisaka replied tersely. "I'll give you 20 gold, 10 each," I said. "You do not have 20 gold," he countered. "I'll borrow it and pay it off by killing things in the dungeons with those swords." "No, you shall not, because I will not be selling them." "Pardon me," Alern interrupted. "Time is of the essence. Nash, your party went to explore the part of the dungeon that was revealed by the collapsed wall. You were gone for a day before you exited. Did you encounter any enemies?" "No," I sighed. "We didn't even see any traces of monster activity. It was eerily quiet." "How then did you become separated?" Kirisaka asked, annoyed that he'd been wrong. Or that I kept looking at his swords. "The strap on my pack came loose, and I stopped to fix it. They didn't want to stop, so they kept going," I explained. "I fixed my pack and ran after them, but there was a fork in the path. There weren't any footprints or markers, and I decided to go left. But I guess they went right. I ended up in a sort of labyrinth, and that's when I found the human." "Human?" Alern asked. "Oh, the thing you found in the dungeon. How do you know what it's called?" "It woke up," Yulk said excitedly. I see, Alern stuttered, caught off guard by Yulk's demeanor. "Well, Nash, did you see or hear anything odd on your way out? Any clue to what might have kept them from returning?" When I picked up the human, I was teleported to the entrance of the dungeon with it still in my arms. "I didn't even know the rest of the team was still in there until Chief told me just a few minutes ago," I said. "It's been a couple days. They definitely should have been back by now." "I understand. We'll find them, Nash. Don't worry too much," Alern said. "Let us begin our rescue," Kirisaka said. Alern nodded and they went on their way. Yulk and I continued on our way to guard the human. When we entered the hospital building, there were 3 girls peeking through the door into the human's room. Maybe the chief had a point assigning us as guards. "What are you doing?" I asked. The girls jumped back, falling over each other in the process. The first girl who managed to stand back up was Catalina, the one we'd asked to bring food to the human. "We're just curious," she said. "Yeah," Yini said from the ground. "We wanted to see the new pet." "Pets don't talk," Yulk said. "Pets are for petting. That's why they're called pets." Yini scowled for a moment before she realized it was Yulk that was talking to her. Then her face softened. "It's obvious to everyone, except Yulk, that Yini fancies him. My brother is smart, but he's dumb in his own way." You're right, It's so cute, Nimura interrupted. Are you sure you found it in the dungeon? Yes, I'm sure, I said sternly. And because of that, it may be dangerous. Keep your distance. We can handle ourselves, Catalina said, pretending like she hadn't been cowering when we asked her to feed it. It's pretty small. It's short, but it's also muscular. I get the feeling that it's stronger than it looks. But even if you could fight it, Chief would get mad at you for putting yourselves in the situation to fight it. Especially if you killed it before we found out more about it, I replied. Yeah. Is it some kind of elf? Yini asked. Maybe, but it calls itself a human, Yulk replied excitedly. It may be an offshoot species of elf. Or maybe an ancestor of the elves. We don't know how long it was in that dungeon for. Did it eat? I asked. Yes, I'm pretty sure. The platter looks empty, Catalina said. So you didn't retrieve the platter? I asked smugly. No. It's sleeping. I didn't want to wake it up, she replied defensively. Damn it all, sleeping again? Yulk said with disappointment. Oh well, at least that confirms it's carnivorous like us and not herbivorous like the elves. So maybe it's not related to the elves? Yini asked. Maybe not. Maybe it's related to orcs. We did find it in the orc dungeon after all. I found it. Stop trying to take credit for my find, I said teasingly. Yes, you found it. Anyways, if it's an ancestor of the orcs, then it's probably much stronger than it looks. So Nash is right. You three should be careful, Yulk said. The three girls looked crestfallen. Hearing it from me was one thing. I'm a bit dumb, so they don't think I know what I'm talking about. They always listen to Yulk, though. He's probably the smartest orc in the village, even though he's dumb when it comes to women. Poor Yini, she's got an uphill battle in the fight for his affection. Okay, Yini finally said, we'll go. Sorry. No need for apologies if you don't do it again, Yulk said cheerily. Plus, it'll be safer with Nash and I guarding him. It's a him, Nimura asked. Don't even think about it, I told her. I'm not, she said. Then how do you know what I'm talking about? I asked. Shut up. Nimura always had an eye for odd ones. She frequently flirts with the non-orc traders that pass through. They politely flirt back, but not a single one of them will ever take her up on the offer. It's not very common for other species to interbreed, at least in my experience, but orcs cannot breed with other species. Trying to can be fatal. Well, we should get back to our duties, Catalina said. Agreed, I replied tersely. The girls left and we entered the room quietly. I checked the platter. The human had ate and drank everything on offer. I took a moment to study his features. He had a few scars on his face, which was kind of cool. His black hair was cut short in a way I'd never seen before. If I had to guess his height, I'd say somewhere around 5'10". About as short as the girls, but something about him told me that he's like Kirisaka. I can't quite put my finger on why, but I feel like he's dangerous. Chapter 3. Nick Smith. Adventurer level, not applicable. Human, American. What do you mean you don't want to go to college? Cass asks. I run my hand through her silky hair and reply, I don't want to do anything, not without you. Well, I can probably get into any school that you get into. Or we can do long distance, if you can wait for me, she says with a smile. Of course I can, but, I say, trying to remember what the problem was. Okay, yeah, I guess I'll go to college. Local, though. I don't think I can take a day without seeing you. She smiles as she takes a sip of her coffee. We're on my porch, pretending to be adults by sipping on instant cappuccino. She takes hers with milk, almost half the cup full. I smile at her coffee-flavored milk. Our eyes meet. They glow bright with life, not like what? So did you pass your finals? I haven't taken them yet, I say, but don't worry, I'll pass them. The only class that will give me any trouble is… I trailed off as I noticed the color of the sky is the same as her eyes. Not similar, the exact same. Her eyes are beautiful, but not a normal sky color. The blue is too dark for this time of day. I look around. Why is the gas station across the street? What's going on? Translator module functioning, she says. Maintenance required. What? I ask. Biology, she says. That's the class that gives you trouble, right? Or is it anatomy and physiology? Oh, it's anatomy and physiology. The school got the gym teacher to do it, I reply. And he's bad at it? I look around again. We're not on my porch. We're in the road. Hey, are we supposed to be here? I ask. Of course, baby, she replies. This is where it happens. Where what happens? A thunderous crack rings out and the sky turns dark green in the blink of an eye. I panic and try to grab her hand. No one's there. I'm alone in the middle of the road. Where did she go? User interface non-functional. Interdimensional energy adapter functional. Personality matrix non-functional. Where's that voice coming from? What the hell is happening? Nanomechanical interface non-functional? So you think he's an orc? My eyes snap open to see a wooden ceiling. I know this ceiling. Damn it! What was that dream? I sit up and see the two orcs staring at me. Nash and Yulk, brothers. Nash was giving me a glare of suspicion, but Yulk was looking at me eagerly, like a child looking at Christmas presents. I'm not an orc, I said. I'm a human. No, I don't think you're an orc, Nick, Yulk said with a grin. I think you might be an ancestor of the orcs. What? Why would you think that? I asked. Well, look at the facts. You eat what we eat, you were found in our dungeon, and we are roughly the same shape. You're a bit smaller, but that's evolution for you. But I came from another world, Yulk. We don't have magic where I come from. You can't have evolved from humans unless we came from here, I said while stretching. Also, I don't just eat what you eat. I also eat fruits and vegetables. I'll be okay if you keep giving me liver, but I'm not sure what the health effects long-term will be. There was a period of silence. Both orcs looked shocked at what I had just said. I thought we had discussed that I came from another world earlier, but thinking back, I might not have made it clear. I remember telling them about trucks, but maybe I forgot to tell them we didn't have magic. You can eat vegetables? Nash asked, his hand resting on his axe. Yeah, why? The only species that can eat plants and meat that I know of is puppers, Yulk said. Even then, they either eat meat or eat plants depending on the teeth they're born with. Everything else is either carnivorous or herbivorous. My turn to be shocked. This can't be real. Carnivores and herbivores rule this world. But the evolutionary advantage that being an omnivore grants is so massive. How did this happen? Yep, carnivorous or herbivorous. What do you even call something that eats both? Nash asked. Omnivorous, I replied. That's further proof that I come from another world. Being omnivorous isn't all that rare where I come from. Omnivorous, Yulk mumbled. I see, all-consuming. So your kind eats all the plants and animals? Pretty much, but we domesticate animals and farm plants. Plus, we're not voracious eaters. Well, not all of us, I said with a smile. I'll be damned, look at his teeth, Nash exclaimed. Yes, they look like a mix of elf and orc teeth. How exciting! Maybe you're the ancestor of both elves and orcs, Yulk said as he started bouncing. Except that doesn't make any sense. Evolution rarely takes a step backwards. Being an omnivore is much more advantageous than being either an herbivore or a carnivore, I pointed out. I don't see how, Nash said. If you've got to eat both plants and meat, what do you do when you don't have one or the other? That's a good question, Yulk said. We can eat either or. I can be on a meat-only diet or on a vegetable-only diet for an extended period of time, I explained. In my world, there's people, humans who don't eat meat and humans who don't eat vegetables. But they take supplements to even out their nutrients. I chuckled to myself about the unexpected usage of my AP health class. I hadn't known exactly what I wanted to do for a career, but I was leaning toward the medical profession. The funny thing is that my teacher posed the specific problem of being trapped in a meat-only environment or a plant-only environment as one of test essays. Okay, so you're fine for now, but we should be looking out for plants you can eat, Nash said. Yes, please. Most fruits should be okay if herbivores eat them, I said. Then a thought occurred to me. Wait, maybe not. I might end up being allergic to some of the plants here. Ah yes, rashes, sneezes and diarrhea. And maybe sudden death, Yulk exclaimed. Don't worry, most allergies can be treated with magical healing. We've already determined that the healing works on you, so you don't have to worry about being cautious with food. Well, as long as you're near me. Oh, that's a relief. I was trying to remember how allergy tests worked. Healing magic sounds pretty handy. I wonder if it's replaced doctors. If magic users are common and they can all do healing, probably. Hey, wait a minute. What do you mean you've determined that healing magic works on me? I asked. Yulk smiled wide and said, It's how we… Nash moved faster than I'd ever seen anyone move and clasped a hand over Yulk's mouth. Yulk's eyes went wild, and for a second he looked like he was going to attack Nash. But then he calmed down and nodded. Nash released his brother and looked at me. Don't worry about it, he said. I was stunned for a moment, but then guessed that I shouldn't push it. They probably used healing magic on me at some point. As far as why they didn't want to admit it, I could only guess. I looked at my hand again. The scar there had shrank. I wasn't just imagining it. That's a bit of a relief. How common is healing magic? I asked. Not very. It requires a few different things to happen for it to work properly. First, you have to be able to use magic. Not everyone can. I don't know what it's like for other races, but only about a third of our people can use it, Yulk explained. Next, you have to be able to conceptualize what the magic does. This means that you have to be able to somehow visualize the mending process of a wound. This grants you access to the healing spell, which you can use on anything you want. Finally, you have to have enough mana for the spell to heal the wound. If not, you'll pass out. Wait, so if I had a broken arm, you'd have to visualize my bone mending to be able to heal it? I asked. No, the spell works on anything once you gain the visualization. If you can visualize the mending process on skin, that will unlock the spell for you. Then you can use it on a broken arm while having no idea how the bone heals. There are people with large amounts of mana who can't visualize for shit. Explained Nash. They have to have it happen to them before they can create a mental picture of it, so they usually end up with physical enhancement spells and find work as warriors. So the better your imagination, the more powerful of a mage you can be? I asked. Partly, but it's mostly your knowledge of a certain subject. For instance, if you know how fire works but don't have much imagination, you'll be able to unlock middle-tier fire spells. If you have a great imagination but a limited knowledge of fire, same thing. If you have both intimate knowledge of how fire forms and a great imagination, you will unlock the highest tier of fire magic, Yulk said. Same with any other spell. So I probably couldn't summon a dragon then. Nash laughed and said, You could if you made it a pet and then trained it to come when you whistle. But with magic, no. People have pet dragons? I asked with a laugh. A couple of legendary heroes have been known to have dragon companions. There was a king about 300 years back who had a bunch of pet dragons. Got a breeding pair and helped raise the young dragons. Had something like 15 of them, Nash replied. What happened to them? It was 17, and when he died they ran amok, destroyed his kingdom and started in on other kingdoms before they were finally defeated. About 12 of them were killed, the rest went to live in the wilderness somewhere. They're probably still alive, Yulk answered. Still alive? I asked with shock in my voice. Yeah, dragons don't die of old age, or at least nobody has ever seen it happen. There's a dragon that's been living with elves for over 1,200 years now, Nash said. It doesn't do much, though. It's been at least 100 years since it went to sleep. The elves might have moved in after it fell asleep and built around it, Yulk said. No, they tamed the beast. This is known historical fact. I stayed silent as the brothers argued. Magic, dragons, elves, and orcs. I had definitely been transported to a fantasy realm. How? That's anyone's guess. Several feelings rushed through me at once: excitement that I was in a magical new place to explore, sadness at being away from Cass, shame of my excitement. Setting those aside, I still had many questions, the most burning one, though. Do you think I could learn magic? I asked, interrupting the argument. Silence echoed through the room. The two brothers shared a look and then turned back to me. There was a long pause before Yulk finally spoke. Possibly, but not now. There's things going on that demands the chief's attention, and you aren't allowed to wander until he gives you his permission to. You're actually deeper within our village than most non-orcs are allowed, Nash explained. That's because you came from the dungeon. I don't know how the chief is going to approach this, and there may be a lot of legal things that he will need to decide upon. For instance, You were in the dungeon since before we orcs claimed it, which means you might have a legal claim to the dungeon. I doubt that, Yulk said. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to enter it. Not necessarily. Since he was already inside, the barrier may have counted it as an open invitation sort of thing. If that were the case, then the rest of your party would have been teleported out when he was carried out of the dungeon. Even if that weren't the case, the rescue party wouldn't have been able to go in after them. No, it's definitely an orc dungeon. What do you mean by orc dungeon? I asked. And what's this legal claim stuff? Well, you have to pay to claim a dungeon, and you can claim it for either your species or your faction. Most claim dungeons for a species because the loot changes based on who the claim is for. For instance, if you claim it for a kingdom, most of the loot is going to be food or wood or things like that. Claiming for a species can grant magical items and weapons though, Yulk explained. Claiming for an adventuring faction grants the best loot. But then only people from that faction could use the dungeon, which is a dangerous thing politically. So kingdoms, which are the only ones who can afford the cost, usually claim for species. Yep, and the Delver's dungeon is an orc dungeon. Probably, Nash said. Anyway, the chief has a lot of things on his plate at the moment, so you won't be going anywhere for a while. And neither will we. Why did your party need to be rescued? I asked Nash. We got separated. I found you instead of them. I decided to take you with me, and when I picked you up, I was teleported to the dungeon entrance. We had gone a long ways inside, so I opted to carry you out and report instead of finding the others, Nash said with a hint of shame. So they're still trapped in the dungeon. We don't know if they're trapped or even in trouble. But it's been days, and they should have been back by now, Yulk explained. So the chief decided to send some over-10s in after them. Over-10s, I asked. Adventurers that are over skill level 10, Nash replied. Level? The orcs once again shared a look. Yulk shrugged. Even more proof you're from another world. Damn, I was hoping that you were an orc ancestor or something, he said. The Curaguard determines levels. When you register as an adventurer through a church, guild, or governmental organization, a link is formed between you and the Curaguard. The Curaguard assesses your skills, spells, and strengths, and assigns you a level that is shared with all participating organizations. This level determines what kind of jobs you can accept and gives you an idea of where you stack up against other adventurers, Nash explained. Does the Curaguard give you skills or anything? I asked. No, Yulk said. You get skills and strength through training and practical application. You get spells through study and practice. The Curaguard just keeps track. A soft knock at the door interrupted my interrogation of the orcs. The door opened to reveal the cute orc girl carrying another platter of food and drink. She avoided meeting eyes with me and delicately set down the new platter. As she left the room, a different sort of question came to me. How long was I asleep this time? I asked. 2 days, Nash replied. As the revelation that I had slept for 2 whole days dawned on me, so did the smell of the meat. The hunger that had previously gone unnoticed suddenly announced itself in the form of my stomach growling. The 2 orcs chuckled as I began to eat and drink. The front teeth appear to be narrow at the tips to cut through food items, and the teeth next to them look like they rip apart sections of the meat quite nicely. Fascinating, Yulk said. Puish dun examin me will I eat, I said through a mouthful of liver. It's embarrassing. In accordance with the rules of Royal Road, this is the translation of the above dialogue. Please don't examine me while I eat. It's embarrassing. Don't mind me, human. I'm just trying to non-invasively determine more about your origin. Better than the alternative, I would think, the orc said with a slightly malicious smile. I gulped down the gamey meat as the implication of what he said hit home. It hadn't occurred to me earlier, but Yulk definitely fit the profile of a mad scientist who would vivisect me if given half the chance. I didn't take very long to think of my response. Fine, look, but don't touch, please, I said. Yulk frowned mockingly and Nash laughed. I picked up my drink to wash down the aftertaste of my meal as the door to the room burst open. Nash, the rescue party's back, a different orc girl exclaimed. The chief wants you to bring the human. Nash rose from his seat on the bed opposite mine and looked down at me, suddenly serious. He tossed some clothes at me and I caught them. A shirt and pants, again woven instead of made from hide, not exactly medieval, but similar in style. I met his gaze. "Get dressed and let's go," he said. Chapter 4. Kirisaka Raksin Adventurer Level 11, Orc, Nulavan. "Been a while since I was last in the dungeon," Alern said as we reached the collapsed wall. "Same, not since I reached level 9, Ryonu replied. "I was in here last year," Puckin the Vile added. I remained silent. Why would it matter how long it had been? The dungeon changes frequently, passageways shifting and sliding to reveal new threats and rewards. Monster materials, magic cores, gems, precious metals, and even weapons and armor were all up for grabs by those who had the tenacity to brave the depths. Woe be to any who became complacent and assured of victory, though. The dungeon you entered yesterday may very well not be the same dungeon you enter today. Rookie adventurers that learned this fact about dungeons were terrified of being present within the dungeon when the changes took place. It's a natural fear. Being deep within the dungeon with no hope of return would end only in a terrible death. Their fears are allayed when they learn that the dungeon forcefully teleports those within to its entrance when it begins to change. It was for this reason that Alern and I had been opposed to waiting until the morning to enter the dungeon. If the dungeon had shifted in such a way as to block the passage, we would never know what happened to the lost party if they weren't teleported to the entrance. We would only know that they had died. The chief had forced us to wait, though, to make certain we were properly supplied and to give the lost party one last chance to make it to the entrance. I looked at the pile of bricks that laid on the floor of the dungeon. The mortar had come loose, and the weight of the bricks had pulled this section of wall down, exposing a previously hidden passageway. The passageway was lit by stones that had been inserted into the ceiling and gave off a bright white light. It struck me as odd and out of place. Magical stones that gave off light were not cheap, but these were installed every 20 bricks and provided enough light that one would swear a window were nearby. It was far brighter than the rest of the dungeon, and indeed even brighter than most buildings I had been in. I had never seen nor heard of anything like it before. Gluhern was a fool to send under-10s to investigate. "This feels wrong," Ryonu said as we entered the hall. "I can't quite figure out why, though." "There is a suspicious lack of dust," I added. Silence fell over the party as they came to the same realization. It had also been the first time I had spoken since we entered the dungeon. I would have been more verbose if our party hadn't included Puckin the Vile. One's magic tells tales of one's mind, and necromancy was evidence of a twisted mind. She had gained renown by making herself useful to the village, and many believed her to be a valuable adventurer. But I knew the truth. I knew of her sojourns to the wastes to find corpses to experiment on. I had watched as she revived her former comrades as mindless husks to fight her battles for her. I had seen her disregard them after those battles without a second thought. Her magic told a tale of egomania and narcissism, but she masked it well with strategically utilized friendliness and kindness. She was with us only because she was also skilled with offensive and healing magic. Her zombies are much weaker than the bodies that supplied them, so her necromancy would be useless in the rescue of adventurers over level 5, or the pacification to monsters that could kill those adventurers. "This is the fork that Nash mentioned. He went left, so they probably went right," Alern said. "See, Kirisaka. It wasn't a waste of time to interview him after all." "A rare occurrence indeed, for it not to be a waste of time to speak with Nash," I replied. Chuckles came from the rest of the party. Nash was well known for being rambunctious and annoying. When paired with his brother, he became conniving as well. The Alta brothers were troublemakers. Of this there was no doubt. Still, their antics brought about good humors most of the time. I was glad that they weren't a part of this rescue team. I have a foreboding feeling about what's to come. We followed the passage without incident until we came upon sheer and utter darkness. The next part of the passage seemed to be lacking the stones that lit the rest of it. The other party members activated their various lighting mechanisms. The two magic users created small balls of light, and Alern activated his own magical stone inlay on his armor's pauldron. These lights were bright enough to allow us to see that the rest of the passage looked much like that which we had already traveled. I did not activate any lights of my own. The shadows are my allies, and by shunning them I would weaken my combat effectiveness. This darkness nearly set me at ease, for it was far more natural for a dungeon to be dark than for it to be well lit. Do you think a collapse might have prevented their return? Rionu asked. It's possible, Alern responded. I hope that's the case. Any other reason for delay would be unfortunate. Pekin the Vile added. I remained silent as we continued on. Like the party we were sent to rescue, we had been traveling for about a day. A sudden sense of dread came over me. What if the reason that Nash had teleported hadn't been picking up the human? What if it had been because the dungeon was shifting, and the discovery of the human had been coincidental? Then the reason that the rest of the party hadn't been teleported as well would be that they were dead. I opted to keep this line of thought to myself. Nothing good could come of voicing my concerns, and the rest of this party likely had come to the same conclusion. It wouldn't change what we had to do. We had to find the lost party and determine their fate. If it is a collapse, they'd stay nearby the blocked portion of the passage, Alern said. So we just have to find the collapse and dig them out. Easy, Rionu said. Do you think we'll have to share our food? No, they should have enough. They would have brought 7 days' worth of rations. It's only been 4, Pekin the Vile said. Pakin's right, Alern chimed in. There's no reason to worry about them going hungry. Alern cut his sentence short as a soft sound began emanating from ahead of us, just out of sight. We stopped and listened to the squelching and crunching. Our gazes met. It was a sound that we were all familiar with. The sound of a predator eating its prey. We quietly armed ourselves and continued forward slowly and with steady feet. As we crept down the passageway, I noted that the lights hadn't been missing at all. They had been slashed and rendered ineffective. I quietly pointed this out to the rest of the party. We spent a moment quietly guessing to ourselves if the slashing had been done by blade or claw. Then we continued moving, following both the passage and the unnerving sounds of consumption. The passage soon opened into a spacious chamber held up by smooth brown pillars. The floor and walls were also brown. The light glinted off of something metallic on the floor. I gestured for my fellows to halt and edged closer to get a better look at the object, the squelching and crunching getting louder with each step. What I saw, I could barely make sense of. My confused eyes studied the object until realization made my blood run cold. It was a piece of breastplate, shorn cleanly just above the pectoral guards. The metal of the breastplate was thick, but the cut was smooth, as if someone had taken scissors to a piece of cloth. Whatever had done this was unbelievably powerful or sharp, or both. I looked at Alern, realizing that his armor would likely only be a hindrance in the coming fight. Our eyes met, and by his steely gaze I could tell he had realized it as well. We continued further into the chamber, and I glanced around for signs of the enemy. I noticed patches of white on the ground, walls and pillars. I looked closer and realized that the room had originally been white, and with a sniff I came to the conclusion that the brown staining was from blood. I looked around with horror, the blood stains covering nearly every inch of the chamber. It was more blood than one orc could possibly provide. The light suddenly shined upon a figure, hunched over with its back to us. Its skin was sickeningly pale, with thin white fur. So thin that the fur was largely absent, with the exception of the creature's crown. The hair upon its head was so abundant that it fell past its shoulders, moving almost hypnotically with the twists and jerks of the beast. These movements aligned with the squelching and crunching, and I soon realized it was holding what was left of an arm. We froze. The horror before us finished its grim meal and turned to face us, rising as it did so. It was as tall as I was, and stood on 2 legs just as I did. I looked upon a face that could have been my own, were it not so pale. The only color on this creature were its blackened eyes, sunken into its skull from disuse, and the fresh blood dripping from its maw. From the tips of its stiffened fingers extended long claws, discolored by blood both new and old. They were the size of daggers, and almost assuredly just as sharp. I quickly stepped into the shadows as the rest of the party readied themselves to fight the creature. It turned his head to follow my movements as if it knew where I was without having to see me. It was smiling at me. "Pack in, burn the bastard," shouted Aelern. Pakin the Vile took a stance and shouted, On refni reteg TSA. I was barely able to follow what happened. I watched helplessly as the creature moved in one swift motion, closing the distance between itself and Pakin and separating her from her head before she could finish her spell. I watched as her face grew confused and then shocked before it stopped moving entirely. Her body crumpled to the ground, her magical ball of light snuffing out and shrouding the creature in darkness once again. Run, I shouted as I charged the creature. My blades met claws with a sound similar to thunder. The creature was just as strong as I had feared, and it pushed me until my back pressed against the nearest pillar. Kirisaka, Aelern shouted, hefting his sword to ready a blow. No! Run! Run now! Go! I shouted, struggling against the creature's might. They have to go. They need to warn the chief. The lost party is dead, and any further. Rescuers will die as well. I'm the best matchup against this creature's strength and speed. They have to realize this. Go warn them, I screamed as the creature tilted its claws to dig into my shoulder. With pained expressions, they turned and fled. I sent a bone-shattering kick into the knee of the creature. Instead of collapsing as it should have, it merely lost its balance long enough for me to free myself. I ran deeper into the chamber, trying to draw it away from my fleeing comrades. It followed me into the darkness. Noisive Woda stack, I said, casting shadow vision just in time to dodge a wild slash from the creature's clawed hand. I counter-slashed and scored a blow on its outer thigh. It didn't go as deep as I had hoped. I slashed and dodged again and again, the creature matching my movements with impossible skill. The macabre smile never left its face. I tapped into every fight I'd ever fought, every training session I'd ever been in, every trick I had learned or seen trying to find a way to score a decisive blow. The creature managed to dodge most of them. Those that it didn't weren't enough to even give it pause. I'm getting tired. I don't know how long it's been. I hope they managed to get away. It's a fair trade. No, there's no time for melancholy. An opening. I perform a standard double slash with all of my strength, aiming for the creature's exposed neck. The creature slashes at my swords just before the blow hits home in an attempt to block. I use the momentum from the slash to roll and put some distance between us. I hear pieces of metal strike the ground and bounce. I look at my swords and to my horror, I'm only holding the hilts. The creature turns to me and I cast the broken blades aside and draw my knives. As the beast approaches, I throw one of them as hard as I can. A palpable blow. The knife sinks directly into the creature's eye. It stops dead in its tracks, and I breathe a sigh of relief. Then the creature reaches up to its face and pulls the blade out of its skull, tearing its own eye out with it. The bastard is still smiling, even as its own blackened blood flows down its face. Fuck you, I shout defiantly as I bring my final knife to bear. It charges at me. I barely manage to dodge the strike, slicing into its arm as I do. Another shallow blow, barely enough to draw blood. Curse this vile fiend. It slashes at me once again, but this time it anticipates my dodge and kicks at me as well. I am sent flying, the shock stifling the pain. I slam into a pillar, dropping my knife, but I manage rise fast enough to grab the creature's hands, temporarily preventing it from impaling me. I struggle against its strength, trying to move the claws away from my chest. But the creature is strong, and they inch closer and closer. I stare into its remaining eye with determination. But the claws inch closer and closer. I scream at the beast as I feel the claws pierce my armor, and then my skin, and then my bones, and finally my scream is cut short as the claws rip into my lungs. I let go of one of the hands and reach for the creature's head, grasping its ear and tearing it off. The creature rears back in pain, pulling its claws from my chest. Too late, though. Even as the creature fills the air with shrieks, I can no longer breathe. The ear falls from my hand to the ground, along with my blood. As my vision fades, I see my prize for the first time. I mentally chuckle at the absurdity of the shape of the ear. Who ever heard of a round ear? Chapter 5. Yulk Alta, Adventurer Level 7. Orc e Nulavan. Nash and I turned around to allow the human to get dressed in privacy. Nash was on edge the entire time that our backs were turned. He must still think the little critter could be a threat. He's not wrong, I suppose. Not the kind of threat that would attack you without a weapon, though. The kind that could outthink and outmaneuver you on a battlefield. Maybe. This human had just awoken and had already demonstrated knowledge of fringe intellectual pursuits like evolution and nutrition. It spoke of things I had spent extensive effort to learn, as if they were common knowledge. My younger brother had stumbled onto a goldmine of knowledge. Even if the human didn't have any more knowledge than what he had already displayed, just studying his anatomy would be revolutionary. He would likely be opposed to vivisection, though, even with healing magic available. "I'm ready, I think," Nick said. My brother and I turned around to look at the human. He actually cut a dashing figure, if you're into that sort of thing. Trimmed black hair that was longer on the top than on the sides, dark blue eyes with a hint of green, a chiseled jawline, and a musculature that was reminiscent of a fighter. He had a scar to the right of his chin that was barely noticeable, and a much more noticeable scar on his left temple. He could pass as a short elf or a tall dwarf were it not for the ugly round ears. Nash was right. They're very jarring now that I look closer. "All right, let's go," Nash replied. We exited the room with the human to my left and Nash to the human's left. The girls were peeking around the corner of the hallway, curious of the human's activities. Yini and Nimora were enamored with the thing, but Catalina seemed afraid of it. I will have to remember to ask her about her reasons for that. Perhaps it's merely a phobia, but she might be able to detect something that I can't about the human. I had no reason to believe the same of Nash, though. My brother was infamously overreactive and overprotective. His near hostility towards the human makes little sense, since he's the one that brought it from the dungeon. I glanced at the human as we walked. It walked very similar to Nash, fully upright with a steady gait. Unlike Nash, it was keeping its eyes ahead and trying to avoid making eye contact with the orcs that quickly shuffled out of our way. As we continued on, I wondered if the human was a warrior or a mage of some sort. Not everyone has to be, of course. There are many who are neither, most even. But something told me that the human was special in more than its rarity. I might be setting myself up for disappointment, but I really want to see what it's capable of. I wonder what adventurer level it is. No, wait. It had shown ignorance of magic. While that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have martial combat experience, it's unlikely to be above level 2 if it's never heard of magic. Perhaps instructing it on magic would boost its level. "Listen, Nick, when we get to the chief's chamber, you need to be quiet unless you're directly asked a question. You're technically an outsider, and you're deeper in our village than an outsider is allowed to be. An outsider meeting the chief in the chamber is unheard of, so if you're rude, there's bound to be bad consequences," warned Nash. "I understand. I'll keep quiet," replied Nick. "Oh, I don't think it'll be all that dire," I said. "After all, Nash is the reason you're here. If you do anything naughty, he's liable to take the blame." I returned Nash's glare with a malicious grin, a not-so-subtle reminder that all this is his fault. But I'll likely have to remind him that whatever the fate of his team is, he's not to blame for that. They went off on their own volition, and he wasn't even their leader. He was their strongest, but Graz was the leader. And Graz decided to leave their strongest behind and continue on, and the others followed him. If Graz survived, I'm going to give him a good skull-shaking for his stupidity. We entered the chamber and my blood ran cold. Alern and Rirnu stood before the chief, looking ashamed. I didn't waste time wondering where Pakin and Kirisaka were. These two wouldn't be here alone if things had gone well. A boss had been encountered. "Nash, I'm sorry," said Gluhern. "Your party didn't make it." Nash's jaw tightened as the realization hit home. He looked at Alern and Rirnu, and both of them avoided his eyes. He swallowed and nodded at the chief. I reached over and patted his elbow to comfort him. He'd need a drink tonight. "Chief," I began, "I take it that Kirisaka and Pakin didn't make it either." "Correct." "Was it a boss?" "We believe so." "What are we going to do about it?" "That's what we're deciding," Gluhern said, and pointed to the human. "I wanted to speak to that to find out more information. Care to introduce us?" "Allow me," said Nash. We all looked at my brother, not expecting him to be able to speak yet. Perhaps I didn't give him enough credit, and he already knew that what happened wasn't his fault. Nash is a great brother. He's full of surprises. Never boring. This is Nicodemus Liam Smith, a human who may have been transported to our world from another world. He goes by Nick, Nash said, gently pushing the human forward. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Nick said, bowing at the waist. Everyone froze for a second. Despite the grim attitude of the meeting, there were a few chuckles. I am not a king. I am a chief. You need not genuflect to me, Gluhern said with a chuckle. Need not genuflect? A remarkable increase in vocabulary, I said, while jerking my head to the left to dodge a thrown goblet. Don't patronize me, sorcerer, Gluhern yelled. The metal goblet clattered behind me. I grinned. Most of the drinking utensils in the village were either made of wood, glass, or ceramic. The chief had tired of having to order replacement cups and had changed all of his utensils to metal. This was much more economical, considering that this type of spat of ours is nearly traditional at this point. I frequently critiqued Gluhern for several reasons. The first and foremost reason was that I got amusement from his reactions. The second reason was to remind him that even though he is a chieftain, he is still an orc like the rest of us. It's all too easy to forget a simple fact like that when your word is law. The third reason is to keep my reaction time healthy. I stole a glance at the two surviving members of the rescue party and immediately regretted my shenanigans. Arlern, who was normally mountainous, was now staring into the distance as if lost in thought and looking significantly deflated. Renu was struggling not to cry. Gluhern and I met each other's eyes, and I could tell we both felt shame at our outbursts. I'm sorry, Gluhern said to everyone except me. Nick, I called you here because you were found in the Delver's dungeon, around the same area as the beast that will be the topic of discussion. Alern, please describe what happened. At the mention of his name, Alern returned to reality and began his tale. We all listened raptly, especially when he described the creature, skin nearly as white as its hair, with claws like daggers, standing like and as tall as an orc, and with speed that matched a shadow warrior's. The way it moved when it killed Pakin, almost too fast for even an over 10 to see. Very interesting, but in a very dangerous way, something I would rather read about instead of personally study. Unless it were dead, of course. When we returned to the collapsed portion of the wall, we waited for Kirisaka to catch up, Alern said. But, after waiting for a very long time, we were teleported to the entrance. Without him. Every face listening to the story dropped except for Nick's, who looked confused instead. The human looked like he wanted to ask questions, but was hesitating due to our warnings. The dungeon shifts frequently, and when it does, it teleports the adventurers still wandering around inside to the entrance, I explained softly. The only time it won't teleport someone to the entrance is if they're dead. The faces that the human made were interesting. They were alien, but so communicative that I immediately knew what they meant. His confusion turned to realization, then sadness, and then as he turned back to look at Arlern, empathy. It was at this moment that I realized that Nash was completely in the wrong about this little creature being a threat. My eyes locked with my brother's. He had seen the empathy on the human's face and knew he had been wrong. His hand dropped from the handle of his axe for the first time since we left the hospital. The only way the human could be a threat is unintentionally. Thank you, Alern, Gluhern said before turning back to Nick. Have you ever heard of this beast or anything like it? No, Chief, the human stammered, shocked by the question. No need for honorifics. Call me Gluhern, please, the chief said gently. Right, sorry, no I haven't, Gluhern. Until I woke up yesterday, I hadn't even heard of a dungeon. In my world, monsters aren't real. Neither are orcs, elves, or dwarves, not even magic. It's just humans and animals. I'm sorry I can't be more help, Nick said with a genuine tone. I understand, thank you. I'll be wanting to discuss your world more in a bit. But first, the topic of what to do with the creature must be addressed, Gluhern said. I don't think we have a team strong enough to beat it, Renu said. This was quite the revelation from the veteran healer. We had all suspected this to be the case after hearing Alern's recount, but hearing it said aloud by Renu seemed to set it in stone. There was nobody else in the village who knew the limits of our adventurers better. Well, we'll have to do something. We can't risk adventurer parties running into the damned thing, and closing the dungeon indefinitely will spell the death of this settlement, the chief said. What about a barrier? I asked. Block off the path that leads to the part of the dungeon with the beast in it. If we use a runic barrier and warn everybody not to mess with it, the beast won't be able to leave the part of the dungeon that it's currently in. And what's to stop it from attacking the crew sent to set up the barrier? Alan asked hollowly. It could be that pale due to living in the darkness for a long time, Nick said, which means it's probably got an aversion to light. Light is usually a bad thing in deep darkness. We all looked at the little human with various emotions on our faces. My face held curiosity, Gluhern's held amusement, Aelern and Rirnu looked thoughtful, and Nash looked annoyed and angry. I almost laughed when I realized why Nash was upset. He believed the human had spoken out of turn. Yes, you may be right, Rirnu said at last. The lights leading to the room we found the beast in were all slashed and broken. We all had lights on, though, Aelern said. True, but the lights in the hallway were much brighter than our lights. There were times where I nearly forgot we were underground, Rirnu said excitedly. Then his mood soured and he said, but if that's the case, then we all could have run for it, and Kirisaka didn't have to. Hindsight is helpful as long as you don't make it a hindrance, I said. This isn't a case where you should have known better and should be chided into doing better next time. There's no way you could have known. Even I, with all of my learning, have never heard of a beast the likes of which you have described. The pair looked at me with gratitude in their eyes. Okay, then we'll put a barrier up at the broken wall as soon as possible. We'll make it the strongest runic barrier we can make, damn the expense. While the barrier is up, we'll send a missive to the kingdom to make them aware of our troubles and request elite adventurers to vanquish the beast. There's bound to be enough loot to make it worth their while, Gluhern said. Does this satisfy your concerns, Aelern and Rirnu? No, Aelern replied, falling to his knees. I am shamed, Chief. I am meant to be the greatest warrior in this village, yet I fled in terror, leaving my closest friend to die. This turn of events wasn't unexpected. Aelern was known for being honorable and wore heavy plate mail, despite wielding a great sword for the sole purpose of being a bigger target. He prided himself on taking all of the hits for a party, keeping them safe while they fought. Nash and I locked eyes. He had clenched his teeth again. Then the chief spoke. You are not shamed. You have worked harder than most to be as strong as you are, so it is unlikely that you could have worked any harder or been any stronger by the time your party faced this monstrosity. If the roles had been reversed and Kirisaka had ran while you fought, you would have died as quickly as Parkin. But Chief, no, listen to me, Aelern, it was a bad matchup. Your strength is great against strength, but that creature surpassed your strength and was many times faster than you. It would have cleaved through your armor in mere moments and then been on Kirisaka and Rirnu. Kirisaka would have died either way, and the village would be left with one fewer adventurer, Gluhern said, leaning back in his seat. Even if you are to be shamed, I cannot think of a worse punishment than having to continue on as an adventurer without your closest comrade. Mourn Kirisaka, comfort his family, heal your mental wounds, and get back to work. Do you hear this judgment? Yes, Chief, the mountainous orc said. Good. You both have 3 days off, and then you'll report this situation directly to High Chief Ulamak. Aelern, Rirnu, you two are dismissed. Nash, Yulk, please remain. The 2 over-10s left the chief's chambers, leaving Nash, Nick, and myself standing before Chief Gluhern. I always found it awkward when I had to witness Gluhern actually be a chief. I much prefer being blissfully ignorant to his wisdom and continuing on as if he were a bumbling fool. No matter, I'm sure his bumbling ways would make themselves evident again soon enough. Now, what to do about you, Nick? Gluhern asked. We should find a way to grant him citizenship of the village, or whatever the equivalent of citizenship is for a village, I said, tapping my chin at the quandary. I know he's shown that he can be useful, but he's not an orc. This is an orc village, not a mixed village. It's part of our mandate. So why? Well, the fact that we found him in the dungeon could pose problems in the future if we don't. Dungeons are first come, first served, but not necessarily first registered, first served. He's been in the dungeon presumably since before we settled here, since none of us saw him enter, I said, placing my hand on Nick's shoulder to keep him from trying to correct me. If we send him on his merry way, everyone that he runs into will have questions about his origins. Some of those answers may get back to the Kuraguard, and that could result in an investigation, which would result in our claim being temporarily revoked, or even permanently revoked if it finds in favor of the human. I see, Gluhern said, narrowing his eyes as if to try to see through my bullshit. If he were part of the village, then our claim couldn't be revoked. His claim on the dungeon would merge with ours. Would that be satisfactory to you, human? Gluhern asked. Yes, Nick said as I squeezed his shoulder pointedly. Okay, now the problem is, how do we go about doing this? I'm certain His Majesty won't approve of us just adding him to our roster. Adoption. High Chief Ulamak can't contest an adoption, Nash said. I'm sure Mum wouldn't mind. What do you think, Yulk? I was shocked at the suggestion. It was surprising enough that Nash was suggesting that the human be our brother, but the actual cleverness behind the scheme was even more surprising. He was correct. The High Chief can't contest an adoption. He was also correct that Mother would likely go for the scheme. She had a big heart and loved non-orc company. I couldn't help but grin at how conniving my brother was being. I'm sure she wouldn't mind at all. That's a great idea, actually, I replied. That would also settle the matter of where to keep him. We just clean out a room for him. I've been meaning to move my laboratory to the alchemists anyway. Good, then it's settled. We'll talk to Mom and get the human moved in, Nash replied while turning to Nick. Then he asked in a dangerous tone, unless the human has an objection. No, I don't. Thank you, Nick said. All right, sounds good. Nick will have to remain in the hospital until Yilda makes the adoption official, though, which means you're still on guard duty, Gluhern said with a chuckle. Ah, if I could have a moment, Chief, I asked. Sure, Nick. Nash, you're dismissed. My brother looked at me with curiosity before deciding that he'd rather not know why I wanted to spend more time with the Chief. Nick and Nash turned and left, leaving Gluhern and I alone. I'd been wanting to have this conversation for quite some time, and I had been thinking about the best way to broach the subject. Gluhern opened his mouth to speak, but I interrupted him. I'd like to teach the human how to use magic. Chapter 6. Nick Smith. Adventurer level, not applicable. Human, American. We should wake him up, Yulk said, his voice doing just that. Don't get impatient. We've got a lot to do today. He'll need his rest, Nash replied. Silently giving my wholehearted agreement to Nash, I pretended to still be asleep. We do have a lot to do today, and I can't wait to get started, Yulk exclaimed loudly. It won't be as fun as you're imagining, and it will be even less fun if he's half asleep all day, Nash stated. The only thing I could think of that we had to do today was move me from this hospital to Nash and Yulk's mum's place. Since I didn't have any stuff, that shouldn't take all day. Unless there were ceremonies or something. I don't want to take part in a ceremony, though. Fun or not, it's still exciting to see what training will bring out in him. Is he strong? Is he weak? Only one way to find out, and we can't do that while he's asleep. Yulk nearly shouted. A feeling of dread spread through my core. Training. I doubt they had virtual reality, which would mean actual fighting. And since Yulk doesn't appear to be the physical fitness guru of the village, that will mean fighting against Nash. A fight against a 10 inches orc that has muscles that professional bodybuilders would kill for? No thanks. I'll pretend to be asleep all damn day. Quiet down. Why are you so excited about his training? The only thing you care about is whether he can do magic or not, Nash said. Magic? The abilities of those with magical talent are frequently opposed to the abilities of those with physical talent. So if he's bad at physical skills, then he might be amazing at magical skills. Or if he's good at physical skills, he might be terrible at magic. That would be disappointing. But either way, it will answer questions that I have, Yulk said, toning his voice down a couple of notches. Although there's a chance that he's good at both. We've never seen anything like him, so it doesn't make sense to apply our own limitations to him offhand. So which would you rather have him do first, magic or muscle? Nash asked. Magic, I said, sitting up. Both orcs turned to look at me. Nash raised an eyebrow at me as Yulk began to smile ear to ear. The mental image of a grinning demon was difficult to shake, especially with the sharp teeth. Nash stood up and looked down at me. Fine, we'll do magic before testing your physical abilities. Before we do any of that, though, we're going to introduce you to our mum. She's going to decide whether or not you get to stay with us, and if she decides you can stay, you're going to become our brother, he said. Don't be expecting any fanfare, though. Best you'll get is a big dinner tonight. Indeed, elves and dwarves may throw lavish celebrations, but orcs rarely do, Yulk added. Do humans celebrate often? It depends on the humans, I answered. Some celebrate every chance they get, others never celebrate anything. There's a lot of in-between, too. Nash looked impatient. Let's go. Mum's already up, so we might as well get this out of the way. I quickly got dressed and followed the two orcs out of the hospital and down the street. The more we walked, the more I noticed the buildings in the village. There were a lot more than I thought there'd be. These buildings looked as if they were made from different architects, and those architects were trying to outdo each other. Some were made of wood, some were made of a type of grey brick, and others were made of a mixture of materials. Some buildings were obviously houses or shops, but others were anyone's guess. There was also plenty of plant life, grasses, trees, bushes, and everything else you would normally see in a wooded area. On the horizon were mountains, looking like jagged black teeth that had just bit a pouch of white paint. They reminded me of the Rocky Mountains, but with less snow on top. It was comforting in a way. I also noticed that we were getting a lot of stares. I felt a little self-conscious, but completely understood their curiosity. I tried imagining the reactions that humans would have to an orc being escorted down a busy street. Actually, come to think of it, most people would probably just assume it was a really good cosplay. I chuckled to myself as I realized that little kids would likely have the most appropriate reactions to that situation. As we walked, Nash and Yulk nodded and waved to people that we passed. The village seemed too large for everyone to know each other, so these two seemed to have a lot of friends. I had some friends back in my world, but not close enough for me to be broken up by their absence. More like the hanging out if it's convenient and occasionally vent with kinda pals. Even so, Cassandra's illness had closed me off in a big way. I didn't have time for anyone but her because our time together was so limited. She hated that, but understood that it was my choice and the only way that I could cope. I had been hoping for some miracle to happen, and now I'm just hoping to get to see her one more time. I was pulled from this line of thought by Nash pointing to a big wooden house surrounded by an equally wooden fence. That's ours, he said. We approached the gate and two large creatures that looked like a lot like dogs came bounding out of the front door, yelling as they came. They were about twice the size of a husky and similarly shaped, but completely without fur. Their skin was black with green stripes. I was startled by their size and appearance, as well as the fact that they weren't barking so much as shouting "hey" over and over. Yulk noticed my expression. Those are puppers, Dima and Nucho specifically. Dima is carnivorous, Nucho is herbivorous. You'll be able to tell by the teeth, he explained as Nash wrangled them back into the house. I followed Yulk closely, suddenly feeling out of place. I also found it odd that I hadn't felt this out of place before. I guess it must be how lived in this house feels compared to everywhere else I had been. Makes me feel like I'm intruding. It looked about as clean as a normal house and smelled like unfamiliar cooking and cleaning. Like going to a new friend's home. The furniture in the house was similar to that of the hospital, like modern-day medieval knockoffs. Tables with metallic inlays, wooden chairs with padding on the seats and backs, and even doors with metal handles. Nash was struggling to hold on to the puppers as Yulk led me deeper into the house until we entered the kitchen. At the table sat an orc woman who gave me a warm smile when she saw me. I had expected her hair to be black like Nash's, but it was blonde with some grey strands here and there. She had a bit of wizening around the eyes, but other than that, it was hard to tell that she was any older than the two orcs that escorted me here. Her green skin was also a few shades lighter than her son's. Come to think of it, I hadn't seen any male orcs with light skin or female orcs with dark skin. Mum, this is Nick Smith. He's a human. Nick, this is Yilda, mother of Nash, mother of Yulk, and many other titles, Yulk said with pride. I only go by my two most important titles, Yilda said, standing from the table. Nice to meet you, I replied as she walked up to me. She narrowed her eyes to study me closely and placed a hand upon my shoulder. She turned me so that she could look at me in profile, and I was taken aback by how strong she was. Yilda was only an inch or two taller than me and didn't look particularly muscular, but I got the distinct feeling that even if I had tried not to be turned, my resistance would have been futile. After a few seconds of examination and mumbling, she turned back to Nash and Yulk. "He's cute. I'll take him into my care," she said. "Say hello to your new brother, boys." "We already have, Mom," Nash said, still struggling with the dog-like creatures. "Hello, Nick," Yulk exclaimed with glee. "Nash," Yilda said, staring pointedly at the orc in question. "All right. Hello, Nick. Welcome to the family," Nash sighed. "Thank you. I appreciate your hospitality," I replied, nearly choking up. This was a confusingly emotional moment for me. If I were to look at it from afar, I would probably find it funny. In the moment, though, I felt warm and fuzzy feelings. I'd never had siblings before, and the kindness that I was being shown was nearly overwhelming. This orc, this woman, had just given me a once-over and decided to keep me fed and housed. It's not the kind of kindness that you see every day. With the warm and fuzzy feelings came a sense of profound sadness. I miss my parents and I miss Cass. I didn't have the perfect life in my world, to be sure, but the people in it made it worth living. Despite Nash's aggression and Yulk's mad scientist vibes, they seem like good people. I have to find a way back to Cass, but by doing so I'll be abandoning them. And now, they are my brothers. Deep breath in, clench your jaw. Men don't cry, that's the law. A little rhyme that my father taught me when I was younger to help teach me to calm down in emotional moments. I used to tell him that there isn't a law against men crying, and he would smile back and say that not all laws are written. I didn't really know what that meant until high school. "All right, that's settled then. Time for training," Yulk said, nearly bouncing again. "Aren't you going to eat?" Yilda asked indignantly. "There's no time for such things, Mother. We must discover what Nick is capable of. Scientific discovery awaits," Yulk exclaimed. "Yulk, training doesn't work as well on an empty stomach," Nash said. "We'll eat after. Don't want food sloshing around our stomachs ruining things. Let's go, Nick." Nash and Yilda looked at me as Yulk marched past me, holding his staff in the air like he was leading a marching band. I shrugged, not knowing what else to do. "I'm not really hungry right now, but maybe training could change that," I said cautiously. "All right, I'll hang back and get your room ready. Don't let Yulk push you too hard. One of the things he wants to know is your limits, so be sure to let him know once you've reached them," Nash said as he wrangled the puppas into another room. "Have fun, dear. We'll get to know each other a bit better over dinner," Yilda said with a smile. "Thanks," I replied, turning to follow Yulk. "Come on, Nick," Yulk shouted from the door. I hurried after him. We walked through town again, his high spirits unfaltering. I was excited to learn more about magic and whether or not I could do it. I also felt nervous, both because of Yulk's expectations and the fact that magic was likely my way home. If I suck at it, no, negativity won't help. I can do this, whatever this is. We passed many staring eyes until we finally came to what looked like an old-fashioned archery training pit. Bricks surrounded a dirt ring with targets placed intermittently within. Yulk sat on a nearby bench and gestured in front of him. I sat cross-legged in the dirt facing him. "All right, let's begin your magic training," he said with a smile. "Do you have any questions to start off with?" "I don't know enough to have any," I explained. "Fair enough. Magic is easier done than said. It stems from forces that we don't quite understand, but seems to be contained within everything. Those who are attuned to magic often feel as if they should be able to do things that they can't, like move objects without their hands." "Have you ever felt like that?" he asked. "Yes, when I was a kid," I replied. "Excellent," Yulk exclaimed with a grin. "Now, the reason that people get this feeling is because they are partially attuned to the magic that surrounds us. Or they're fully attuned and just aren't attuned to their own magic energy. To use a spell, you have to mix the surrounding magic with your own magic and properly channel it through the natural pathways in your own body." "Pathways?" I asked. "Yes. There are many pathways in the body, your blood vessels, nerves, and digestive system, for example. Your magic pathways are similar but separate. Your magical energy is stored somewhere in your body and can be channeled elsewhere in your body through these pathways. If you concentrate on yourself, you should be able to feel it. Mine is in my brain, he said while pointing to his skull. Okay, I'll try, I replied. I closed my eyes and began to concentrate on my body. I felt my skin tingling from exposure to the sun and whatever else was in the air. I felt my ribs spreading and closing with every breath. I felt my heart beating and the blood being pushed through my veins and arteries. I felt the wind blow through my hair and my clothes resting on my body. Then I felt it, a somewhat electrical energy directly in the center of my upper torso. I pointed at it. It's here. I knew it, Yulk said, pumping his fist in celebration. Okay, for the next part, you're going to have to learn channeling. Your own magic won't be able to do much on its own, so you'll need to intake magic from your surroundings and mix it in your core to fire off a spell. How do I do that? I asked. The easiest way is through breathing. The air has magic in it, and you just need to think about pulling the magic out and storing it in your core. It will mix with your own magic, and you can channel that into a spell, he explained. But you get more by drawing magic in through your channels. I can't feel my channels, though. Exactly. And you won't be able to until you use them. That's why we start out new mages with breath charging before anything else. Go on, try it out. It should take about 20 or so deep breaths to get you nice and charged up. I closed my eyes again and began to do as instructed. I breathed in through my mouth and out through my nose. The electric feeling got slightly more intense, and I could feel the two different magics in my chest. I imagined them combining, and a third kind of magic appeared. It felt amazing, like I had all the energy in the world. A few breaths later, and I somehow knew that I was fully charged up. Okay, I'm ready, I said. What? That was only 10 breaths. Are you sure? Yulk asked. No, well, yes. My core feels full, I replied. Is that bad? The orc studied me with narrowed eyes and scratched his chin for a moment. I don't know, he finally replied. We'll see. Okay, let's go to the targets. We got up and approached the range. From a distance, I had thought they were made of straw, but they were actually statues made of stone. Judging by all the pits and charring, they had definitely seen plenty of use. Yulk picked up 2 stones and walked over to one of the targets. He placed the stones on the target's shoulders and walked back over to me. All right, I want you to try an easy spell. It's called Wind Spear, and its name is a very apt description of what you will need to imagine to create the spell. I'll demonstrate, he said, raising his hand. Rapes-denitsak. I flinched as I felt wind erupt from Yulk's hand, but I also felt the magic and was transfixed. The stone on the statue's left shoulder shattered into pieces. The orc grinned and turned to me, the sun gleaming off his bald head. Like that, he said, you should be able to disturb the stone on the right once you figure out the spell. Wait, do I have to do the incantation? I asked. No, the incantation happens naturally. You can increase the power of a spell by mindfully saying the incantation. But that takes quite a bit of practice, he said with a smile. Now give it a try. Use both hands, though. For safety, since you don't know your channels yet. Will I need a staff like the one you have? Yulk laughed. No. You won't need an arcane focus until you're much further along, even further along than I am. The only reason I have one is because when I was younger, I went on a dungeon raid with Nash and ended up breaking my back. Rirnu did his best to heal me, but he was only level 6 at the time, so I ended up with difficulty walking. So my staff is both an arcane focus and a walking stick, but I use it for walking. Enough about that. Go ahead and try to cast the spell, Nick. Okay, I'll try. I raised my hands and aimed them at the stone. I thought about how wind works, gas molecules bumping into other gas molecules, pushing them along. The pushing is caused by gases getting hotter and colder, which causes them to get lighter or heavier than the other molecules around them. The harder they push, the faster the wind goes. I imagined this happening, but being channeled into a spear that rushed toward the stone. Then I felt a sort of click. Rapes-denitsak, my voice said. I felt the magic in my chest flow through my arms and through all 10 of my fingers. The intensity of the movement almost hurt, but felt good at the same time. The tingling sensation pushed itself out of my fingers, manifesting my will. The air pressure around my hands erupted with a blast of wind that pushed me back a step. Wind spear unlocked. What? I asked, looking at Yulk. I didn't say anything, Yulk said, staring at the target with his mouth agape. I looked at the target, and my mouth dropped open as well. There was dust settling around the statue, but I could see that it was missing its head and shoulder. The stone was nowhere to be seen, and the arm had fallen onto the ground. Behind the target, there was a noticeable dent in the bricks. What the hell? Wind did this? I did this? We stood shocked for a few moments, but then Yulk's opened mouth turned back into a grin as he turned to me. I met his eyes, and he placed his hand on my shoulder, his sharp teeth glistening in the sunlight. He definitely reminded me of a smiling demon. I fucking knew it, he said. We're gonna have quite a time together, Nick. Chapter 7. Nick Smith. Adventurer level, not applicable. Human, American. What the hell just happened? I asked, dumbfounded. You destroyed the stone and a good chunk of the target, Yulk exclaimed. Is that normal? Should I be able to do that? I asked. Among orcs? Absolutely not, he grinned. I've never seen a brand new mage destroy a stone with any kind of spell, but who's to say what's normal for humans? I stared at the destruction I had caused. The severed arm of the statue lay in the stone dust that now covered the dirt of the target pit. The sheer destructive power was staggering. Being able to destroy rocks whenever I want is cool and all, but I want to be able to go home, and I don't see how this is going to help me get there. Or maybe it's a sign of how much magic I can use. I replayed the events in my head. I had imagined wind and cast a spell. When I cast the spell, I had unwillingly said something, and the magic had flowed through my arms in a straight line. Then the wind formed and blasted the statue into pieces. I thought I had heard someone else say something too, but maybe it was the wind. Why was it so strong? Who's to say? Yulk repeated. I'm guessing that your magic core is a bit stronger than what's standard in a beginner. Stronger? I questioned. Why would it be stronger? No idea. Also, maybe stronger is the wrong word. Essentially, the more you use it, the more effective it gets. It doesn't get bigger like a muscle, though. It just gets better at fitting more magic in it. It just squished it in there, Yulk explained as he moved his hands together in a squishing motion. Anyway, you should now know the magical pathways through your arms and out your hands. Kind of feels like blood vessels with all the twists and turns, right? You have more magic pathways throughout your body, and there are certain spells that can be channeled through those pathways as well. You can also take in magic from those pathways to be able to cast spells faster. Wait, blood vessels? I asked, confused. Yes, he replied hesitantly. What's confusing you here? The magic went straight from my core, through my arms to my fingers, I explained, like it was following my bones. Silence fell, and a lot of emotions played out on Yulk's face. Confusion was first, followed by concern, and then deep thought. After a few moments, the grin returned, and he slapped me on the back. You just keep getting more and more interesting, little brother, he exclaimed. The shape of one's channels often determines one's initial magical efficacy, so that could explain how you were able to cast Wind Spear so potently. Wish I knew why they were straight, though. Never heard of that before. Oh well, let's move on. Back to the seats. We walked back towards the bench, and Yulk took a seat. I sat where I'd been sitting before. The orc set his staff in his lap and cracked his knuckles and neck. Confused, I did the same thing, which made him chuckle. As I explained before, the magical pathways in your body run both directions, out from your core and right back into your core. Do you still have some of your own magic in your core? He asked. I closed my eyes and checked. The only magic that was left in my core was my own. It felt the same as earlier, as if I hadn't used any of it at all. Should I tell him that? I already feel like a freak, but he can't help me if he doesn't know everything. Yulk stared at me patiently, awaiting my answer. Yes, I answered hesitantly. It's like I haven't used any at all. Really? He asked. I had theorized that the reason for the potency of your wind spear was that you were using a lot of your magic, combined with the relatively short distance said magic had to travel, of course. Interesting. I wonder if it already regenerated. Or there's just a lot of it. Well, no matter. We'll find out later. I want you to draw magic into your core using the channels that you felt when you cast Wind Spear, just like with the breathing we did earlier. Oh, and don't mix it with your own magic quite yet. Okay, I replied, closing my eyes once again. I focused on the sensation that I felt earlier and tried to imagine the reverse of that sensation. Nothing happened, so instead I imagined that my fingers were straws and I was using them to suck in magic. Oddly enough, this worked, and I soon felt tingling in my arms and the other magic filling up my core. Yulk was right, it took almost no time at all to fill it back up. Done, I said. Excellent, Yulk smiled. Now I want you to exude that magic back into the environment around you. The easiest way to do this is by imagining that your core is a sponge full of water and you're giving it a big squeeze. Pay attention to the pathways that the magic uses to exit your body. I nodded and got to work. The magic traveled along my arms through my fingers and along my legs through my toes. There were exit points in my fingers and toes, but also in the palms of my hands and the soles of my feet. Strange that I hadn't noticed the exits in my palms before. Stranger still, there was another pathway to my head. It began on the left side of my core and traveled behind my left eye, then curved back down behind my right eye and traveled back to my core. Unlike the other channels, it didn't seem to have an exit. All right, I know where my channels are now, but there's one that loops through my skull, I told Yulk. It doesn't have an exit point. Is that normal? It's normal to have channels that seem to be useless. What isn't normal is to only have one, and have the rest of your channels be as straight as your skeleton. Yulk grinned. Right, I replied. Anyway, you can fire a spell out of any pathway that has an exit. The type of spell depends completely on what you're able to picture in your mind's eye. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to do everything with magic, though. There has to be an actual spell for whatever magic you're trying to cast. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Also, the amount of magic in your core will eventually run dry, and you won't be able to do any more spells until it regenerates. How does it regenerate? I asked. Time. Sleeping will help it regenerate faster. So will a full stomach. Finally, there are 3 things that determine how much magic a spell will need. The first is your visualization. If you are having a difficult time visualizing the spell, it will cost more magic to cast. The second is complexity. The more moving parts to a spell, the more magic it will take. The third is the power of the spell. The wind spear that I cast cost a lot less magic than the one you cast, he explained. That makes sense, I responded. Good, you must be mindful of your magic reserves, even though they appear to be quite large. Running out of magic in a time of crisis could be fatal. That's how I broke my back, and I was very lucky that Nash was there. What happened? I asked gently. Yulk sighed and shifted in his seat, his grin fading into melancholy. He rubbed his chin for a time, and then his bright green eyes met mine. This is not a tale I tell freely. Bad for one's reputation, you understand. But since we are now brothers, you should hear it. Perhaps the unfortunate events that led to my injury will end up doing some good as a lesson for you, he said. This was back when I first became an adventurer. 5 years ago or so. Nash had already been one for a year, and I ended up being the same level he was. Being tied with Nash when he had such a year-long head start served to boost my ego. I nodded. I began adventuring with him. We explored the wastes, performed good deeds for other villages, and sought out challenges to test our might. I considered myself one of the strongest mages, despite my level being evidence to the contrary. I believed that the reason I didn't have a higher level was because I only knew a few spells at the time. But I could use those spells more effectively than anyone else. To be fair, this was true. Even the higher level mages couldn't put as much intensity behind their attacks that I could. Where they could burn down a house, I could incinerate a forest. He paused, tapping his finger on his staff. The Delver's dungeon changes its layout somewhat frequently, spawning new monsters and treasures that support the village's economy. However, sometimes it doesn't change for a long time. This is problematic because the deeper you go into the dungeon, the stronger the monsters become. You end up getting less return for your effort. Right, I said. It was during one of these stagnant periods that Nash and I joined a party that was attempting to open a deeper area of the dungeon by defeating a boss. I was warned that this boss was difficult and resistant to magic. They wanted me to perform healing as necessary, but there was another healer in the party, so I got it in my head that I would go on the offensive. You see, the other healer was Rira, a girl I quite liked. I wanted to impress her, Yulk said with a sigh. I was foolish. The boss attacked Rira at the start of the fight, and I got angry. Instead of healing her, I launched a very powerful wind spear right into its eye. After another pause, I asked, "What happened?" It blinked. That was it. I had burned through all my magic, and it had resulted in a blink. The monster launched me across the dungeon into a wall, snapping my spine in several places. Our party took 3 other casualties before we retreated. Nash carried me out of the dungeon, and of the casualties, I was the only survivor. We sat in silence as I digested this information. Of the casualties, Rira got attacked at the start of the fight. Oh no, Yulk's expression had changed to one of deep shame. After a few moments, he stood up and walked over to the targets. I followed him. I am much stronger now than I was then. Magically speaking, of course, he said with a chuckle, but magical resistance is the bane of a mage. Let me give you some context. Context, I asked. Yulk raised his left hand toward one of the statues and said, "Rapes Deniu Tsak." The wind that blasted from his hand was much more powerful than what had come from my attempt. The statue was immediately obscured by a cloud of dust, and when the dust settled, the only part left was the legs. The brick wall had a very clear hole, and the grass behind it had disappeared, leaving a trail of dirt that stretched for a few feet. I looked at the orc in shock. That was the level of spell I hit the boss with. Now I can launch these all day, and I can use Wind Spear at a much higher level as well. But I know that it wouldn't be enough against the monster that killed Rira and did this to me, he said. Oh, fuck, I managed to mutter. Yulk, did you just break the fucking range again? Came a shout behind us. We turned to see Nash jogging up to us, looking angrier than usual. Yulk greeted him with a smile and a shrug, and I shook the shocked expression off of my face. Naomi will fix it, Yulk said. She shouldn't fucking have to, Nash replied. What's the point of a range if you have to hold back? Yulk asked. All sorts of things. Practicing new spells, practicing spell repetitions. There's literally tons of things you can do without breaking the damned thing. Honestly, Nash, it's not like Naomi has anything better to do. Her entire job is to repair the range. You should be more courteous. Her job being very specific doesn't give you the right to make it harder. I interjected. Both orcs looked at me, shocked by the interruption. Their shocked faces gave me the courage to continue. Yulk was demonstrating the importance of keeping one's ego in check. The destruction was necessary to show me the level of power he had compared to my own, and he did hold back quite a bit, I think. Nash's shock turned into a glare. I maintained a straight face, not backing down but also not escalating. We remained like this for what seemed like forever, but Nash finally blinked first. Fine, but you're apologizing to Naomi, Nash finally said, turning back to Yulk. Deal, I'll buy her dinner, Yulk said with a grin. So, difference in power, huh? Does that mean you're a mage, Nick? Nash asked. Yeah, I figured out how to use Wind Spear and where my magic pathways are, I said with a bit of excitement. The excitement was due to my accomplishment and the fact that being a mage meant I wouldn't have to spar with Nash. I had been dreading the thought of fighting the giant orc, even if it wasn't a serious fight. One slap from him would probably end me. How about we check to see your martial prowess? Nash asked. What? I asked. Yulk said that you might be able to do both. Indeed, Yulk replied. Your build suggests a certain level of physical combat ability. Only one way to find out. I felt the blood drain from my face as my orc brothers both began to grin at me. Chapter 8. Nick Smith. Adventurer level, not applicable, human American. This is the arena, Nash said, gesturing around him. When Nash had mentioned where we were going, I had expected something shaped like the Colosseum. Instead, it was a dirt patch encircled within a wooden fence. Leaning on the fence were a few orcs who were interested in what we were doing. Great, now I'm going to get my ass kicked in front of an audience. I think we should begin unarmed, just in case, Yulk said with his trademark grin. If he does well, we can move on to practice weapons. I agree. All right, Nick, take a stance. I'm going to try to hit you. You can either dodge or counterattack, Nash said, widening his stance. Ready? No, I stated flatly. Too bad. Begin. I dropped into the karate stance I was familiar with, and Nash rushed forward. He threw a punch, but as he began to move his fist to my face, it slowed down. Even so, I barely managed to move out of the way. The wind from his punch made me blink. Good time dilation unlocked job. You managed to dodge. That's promising, Nash said. What did you say? I asked, rubbing my ears. What? Have you gone deaf? I didn't even hit you, he replied. No, I don't know. I thought I heard something. Doesn't matter, let's go again. Try to counterattack this time. Don't hold back. It's not like you can hurt me, he said with a laugh. Famous last words, Yulk muttered with a smirk. Nash glared at Yulk for a moment and then turned back to me. He dropped into his stance, and the moment I did the same, he rushed forward. As he threw his punch, time slowed down again. I fought my urge jump out of the way and instead moved my head to the side to avoid the blow. Then I threw a punch of my own. I meant to hit him in his solar plexus, but my fist went slightly lower. It was as if it were moving by itself. I connected and felt his body tense up as if I had struck his diaphragm, but he rushed past me instead of doubling over. Breathtaker strike unlocked. What the fuck was that? A voice? No, more like static in headphones when you have them too loud, just behind the music. I should ask Nash about it. I turned to him and paused. He was standing up, but rigid and unmoving. Nash, you okay? Yulk asked with a shit-eating grin. Nick didn't hurt you, right? 'Cause you're too big and strong, right? Nash glared daggers at Yulk and opened his mouth to retort, but the only sound that escaped was a groan. He snapped his mouth shut and doubled over, placing his hands on his knees to steady himself. Then he began gasping for air. Yulk and the onlookers began laughing uncontrollably. After a few moments, Nash sat down and looked at me with a mixture of anger and confusion. What in the hell was that? He asked. I don't know. I think it was called a breathtaker strike, I answered. Remember what the distorted voice thingy had said? Well, it definitely did that, Nash said as he stood back up. Okay, I'll admit. You're not bad with hand-to-hand. When did you learn how to do that? I took karate. I used it more for working out than actual fighting, though. Kurate, you ever heard of that skill, Yulk? Nash asked, glaring at the still laughing sorcerer. No, Yulk said between laughs, I haven't. Probably something from his world, but maybe an unarmed specialist would know more. It's not a skill. Well, not what you mean by skill, I interrupted. With karate, there's a chance to do it wrong. But when I went to hit you, I thought your solar plexus was higher up, but my hand moved on its own to where it actually is. Yeah, that's how skills work. The skill will only activate when the circumstances are right for it to be able to do its thing, Nash explained. So the name of that skill is karate, huh? No, the skill's called breathtaker strike. Karate is a form of martial art, like a style of fighting, I explained to their blank faces. Right, well, never mind the jargon. You've got both magical and martial prowess, Yulk said with what was quickly becoming a trademark grin. I don't know, magicians also have some hand-to-hand combat skills, Nash tapped his chin. Let's try you out with a sword. A sword? Surely a spear would be better? Yulk asked. A spear is too easy to learn. If we really want to know what he can do, we should see if he is able to unlock any sword skills, Nash explained as he grabbed 2 wooden swords and tossed one to me. I'm fine with that, I said as I caught the practice sword. You really shouldn't be, Yulk warned. I fear that Nash is trying to get back at you for embarrassing him. Nash grinned widely at me as I took my stance and immediately disappeared from view, leaving only a small cloud of dust in his wake. I panicked and rolled forward, barely managing to avoid the blow that would have hit me directly on the ass. I glared at Nash as I regained my stance. I swung wildly at him, but he deflected my blow with ease and danced back with a laugh. I tried to remember something that could help me land a blow, but nothing came to mind. I'd seen plenty of movies with sword fights, but I knew better than to think that those were accurate portrayals. Nash charged at me and swung hard, but I managed to block it and lock blades with him. His smile widened as he grabbed the end of his blade and used the additional leverage to shove me back several feet. "Hey, that's cheating. You can't grab the blade," I shouted. "Why not?" he asked, confused. "Because if it were a real sword, you'd cut yourself." I had said it loud enough that every orc watching had heard me. After a second of stunned silence, they all began to laugh at me. I looked at Yulk, Nash, and the onlookers, trying to figure out why they were laughing so hard. Nash was laughing so hard that he was doubled over, and I briefly considered smacking him upside the head. "This is your first time fighting with a sword, isn't it?" Nash finally settled down enough to ask. "Yeah." "Well, you can grab a blade without cutting yourself. The trick is to make sure you don't drag your hand along the sharp bit." "How else are you to use the pommel?" he asked with a chuckle. I looked at the hilt of my sword and saw that it did indeed have a round bulb at the bottom. I thought this bit was to make sure your hand doesn't slip," I said. "No, it's to bash armor, like a mace," Nash explained, demonstrating a swing while holding the blade. "The secret to sword fighting is knowing how you can hold your weapon, not how you should hold it. Whatever grip works is the one you should use in any given situation." "I see." "Let's go again," he shouted as he charged me. I managed to duck his swing and went for a stab to his midriff. He spun to avoid the stab and grabbed my goddamned blade. "Oh, come the fuck on," I shouted. He grinned as he pointed the tip of his sword at my face. I pulled hard on my sword, but it didn't budge, and then I felt the tip of his sword poke me in the forehead. I sighed as the orcs once again laughed at my efforts. I began to get frustrated as Nash pushed me back and gestured for me to try again. Again and again he outwitted and outmaneuvered me, but I was learning. The tricks he was using weren't going to work twice. Then I felt something. Is this what they call an opening? I knew what to do, how to hold my sword, where to put my feet, and how fast to move. I pushed myself as fast as I could, and I was finally able to put the tip of my sword on his chest. Dash unlocked. "Well, would you look at that?" Nash said with a look of shock. "Was that the dash skill?" Yulk asked. "I think so," I answered. "Ha! He does have martial and magic prowess after all," Yulk said excitedly. "That's really rare, you know." "It sure is," Nash added. "Well, for us, anyway. For all we know, all humans are able to use both magic and martial skills. Although the only way to find out for sure is to find more humans and ask them. Speaking of which, are we able to go into the dungeon?" I asked. "No," both orcs replied in unison. I was stunned by the rapid and uniform response for a moment. The brothers looked at each other and then back to me. Nash squatted down to my height to make eye contact. I suppose he was trying to relate, but it felt infantilizing. "There are a lot of things we need to do before you're able to go into the dungeon, Nick. First, we need to register you with the Adventurers Guild to see what level you are. Then we'd need to train you up a bit more. Getting a sucker punch in on me is impressive in a way. But there's many things in the dungeon that your breathtaker strike won't work on. Indeed, it would be better to start you off with the wastes. The monsters there can be tough at times, but it's much easier to get away from them than it is to escape the ones in the dungeon," Yulk explained. I opened my mouth to protest before I realized that I was about to act like the young punks in movies that cause trouble for everyone by not realizing their very obvious limitations. I closed my mouth and nodded sullenly instead. I don't know how time passes in this world in relation to mine, but if I rush things and end up dying, then I won't get to see Cass again. Even if I were to reincarnate again, what would be the odds of ending up back on my world in my body? That being said, you've met the chief and been adopted into Clan Alta. There really isn't anything stopping us from registering you as an adventurer right now," Yulk said while tapping his chin. "Yeah, Chief probably can't get mad at us for getting our brother registered, right?" Nash asked. "True, I don't recall anyone having to get permission from the chief before," Yulk grinned as he stood. "Let's go." "Are you all talking about registering that thing with the guild?" one of orcs shouted. "What about it?" Nash replied. The guild rep's out right now. Family trouble. She'll be back in a week or two. It'll have to either wait or register as freelance. Both Yulk and Nash winced at this. It seems that the thought of registering as a freelancer didn't sit well with them. They mumbled to each other for a bit and then turned to look at me with grim faces. "We're going to have to wait," Nash stated. "What? Why? What's so bad about being a freelancer?" I demanded. "Being a freelancer isn't bad," Yulk said as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's terrible. The various organizations that allow registration as an adventurer all have one thing in common. They're employee-operated. When you join a guild, union, militia, or whatever other name the organization goes by, you are working for and with your fellow adventurers. When you register as a freelancer, you are working directly for your customers. That's how it is back home," I explained. "That's not so bad, you know." "No, you don't understand," Nash said, crossing his arms. "When you're with an org, you get access to benefits like healers, days off, mental health checks, specialized equipment for jobs, and all sorts of things that make adventuring bearable. Even if you're a member of a nation's military, you're taken care of to some extent. But when you're a freelancer, you have to pay for those benefits on an individual basis. You have to buy your own gear and pay for its maintenance. You can only take days off if you've worked long enough to be able to eat the next few days. To top it off, you only make about half what other adventurers make, if you can even find work at all." He's right, Nick. Usually, if someone goes freelance, it's because they've committed a crime that has resulted in being barred from org membership. Yulk squeezed my shoulder a little. On top of that, the most frequent customers of freelancers are those whose jobs have been rejected by orgs. Usually because the customer can't pay a fair price for the work, or the work is illegal. "You want to go into the dungeon, right?" "Yes, as soon as possible," I answered. "Well, there you have it. Entering the dungeon simply won't be possible as a freelancer. Guilds don't work with freelancers as a rule, and even the chief would be hard-pressed to convince them to allow you to tag along. If Nash and I were able to get permission to enter, we wouldn't be able to bring you along without getting censured." "And getting censured sucks," Nash added. "Very bad for your career." I sighed at the prospect of waiting 2 weeks before being able to register as an adventurer. I had hoped that I could register as a freelancer and then join a guild. But not only does that sound impossible, it sounds like it wouldn't speed things up at all. So what do I do? I raised my hands in a shrug. "You train," Nash said, "magic and martial in equal portions. We'll work on figuring out which weapons you'll be best at and unlocking new spells for you to cast." Great, more training with Nash. Chapter 9. High Chief Ulamak, Adventurer Level, Not Applicable, Orc, Atihi, Kirkinian. I gazed longingly out of my window at the mountains in the distance, a wall of gigantic snow-capped teeth separating the orcish high chiefdom of Kirkina from the elven kingdom of Bolasir. As a youth, I would trek those very mountains, hunting dangerous game and living in the rough. It was the best childhood the son of a high chief could ask for, and my father had given it to me gladly. Mostly because he couldn't stand children, but also because he wanted me to be strong enough to take his place. My gaze returned to the mountain of paperwork upon my desk, a much more difficult climb, with higher stakes as well. Paperwork is boring, but if it's done wrong or delayed, many can suffer. I envy the chiefs of small villages, who rarely have to do any paperwork at all, although they have to listen to complaints in person rather than reading a strongly worded letter, so we'll call it a draw. A knock on my door alerted me to Rezun's presence, one of many aides that help me keep things running. I glanced at him and he said, "Sir, you've received a missive from Emperor Jack, slayer of demons, savior of dwarves, destroyer of—" Yes, Jack has many impressive and lengthy titles. A missive, eh? He finally figured out that I can read then, I asked with a chuckle. "Looks that way, High Chief." Rezun gave me the envelope containing the missive, and I felt a tinge of dread as I noted its thickness. I broke the wax seal with a claw and pulled the contents out into the light. 20 pages. Gods damn it, this had better not be about that damned mine, or I'm going to declare war, I swear, I roared. "Sir, it's almost definitely about the mine. You've been ignoring his requests regarding it for years," Rezun said calmingly. I turned to glare at him. That's because he wants us to let his people mine the metal while giving us a percentage of the metal as a tax. Considering that it is our mine and we know how to mine, I see no reason to pay him any heed. Come on, sir, you know his people can mine better than we can. Most of our miners think that the dwarves will be able to pull more metal out than we can too. Might end up with more as tax than we would do in it ourselves. Is that right? I said sarcastically. And we might as well let the damned elves construct our buildings and the fucking gnomes run our economy, right? And what's left for us, eh? Dungeon running? Scavenging the wastes? And what do we do if the drow decide that they need to lengthen their border? Will we be able to rely on the dwarves, elves, or gnomes to come to our aid? No, sir, Raisin stated with the attitude of someone dealing with a toddler. Exactly. If he wants to be involved in the mine, he can teach our miners how to do it, I grumbled as an idea popped into my head. Wait, that's not a bad idea. We can offer to hire his dwarves as supervisors and trainers and give them a much smaller percentage. Have Palo meet with the Miners' Guild and come up with some numbers. Then have a missive drawn up in reply to whatever this garbage says. Yes, High Chief, Raisin nodded as he left. I nearly threw the missive across the room, but decided that I'd better check it first. It was too polite to have been written by Jack. Like most dwarves, he can't help but curse constantly. I chuckled at all the titles they had for me. It felt good to be recognized, even if it was just for flattery. The actual content of the missive was indeed about the mines, but it also contained a warning regarding the drow. They were performing military maneuvers again. I'd have to increase our presence on that border. I made a note to include a gratuity to Jack for the information. Despite how annoyed we are at each other, our people are friends, and what impacts us impacts them. The drow taking a bite out of us means less trade for them, and a higher risk of the drow taking a bite out of them as well. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean they'll fight them with us. The Dwarven Empire of Kalkuti was more into manufacturing than they were into warfare. There were other Dwarven kingdoms that were more focused on warfare, but those kingdoms didn't have an orcish high chiefdom as their neighbor. If they did, their tune would likely change pretty quickly. Well, so long as those orcs were fight-focused, there's plenty who aren't. My grandfather is considered one of the most peaceful Mer to have ever lived. Actually, come to think of it, he might have been able to convince those kings to become peaceful just by his example alone. I chuckled at the thought, and another knock shook my door. What is it? I demanded. High Chief, there's a messenger from Nulava, Raisin said breathlessly, as if he'd ran back here. You're going to want to hear this in person. Nulava? The name was familiar, but from where? One of mine. Would have to be a small settlement then. Oh, don't tell me that one of the chiefs was dumb enough to make a village on the drow border. Raisin noticed my confusion and explained, Nulava is the village we installed at the entrance to the Delver's dungeon. Oh? What do they want? I asked. My question was met with a look of exasperation. I returned the look with a glare, but Raisin is as stubborn as a pregnant fathorns. It occurred to me that we were both somewhat in the wrong. Fine, fair enough. Bring them in, I relented. Raisin turned to the outside of the door and gestured to someone out of view, then fully entered the room. A minute later, a monstrous orc in darkened full plate entered and kneeled. It took me a second to recognize him. Alern, son of Agurno. My nephew. Alern took a moment before finally saying, Greetings, High Chief Ulamark, son of Grashnor the Giant, savior of— That's enough of that, Alern, I interrupted. My own kin shouldn't have to prostrate themselves before me. As I understand it, you have a message for me. Yes, sir, Alern said and looked up at me. We've encountered some oddities in the Delver's dungeon, and Chief Gluhern sent me to apprise you. I'd forgotten that Gluhern took over for his brother on the Delver project. The thought of that hot head being a chief was enough to amuse even the most stoic orc. Unfortunately, my amusement was dashed by the stench of grief coming from Alern. The boy who was normally cheerful and gentle was now robotic and stiff, his smile replaced by a grim expression that spoke of loss. I nodded to Raisin, who grabbed a cushion and set it next to the boy. Sit and explain, Alern. What happened? I said gently. Yes, sir, he replied as he sat cross-legged on the cushion. A while ago, a wall collapsed in the dungeon, revealing a previously hidden passage. He explained at length about what had happened, And with every sentence my concern grew. A sentient thing called a human had been found and removed from the dungeon, and a boss that killed 2 over-10s had been encountered. Gluhern's plan to seal the passage to the boss was a sound one, but it might be a stopgap, especially since it sounded like the dungeon had already shifted twice and the hidden portion didn't change. "Does Nulliver have any over-20s?" I asked once he finished. "No, sir. Delver's was labelled an entry-level dungeon. The only reason that Gluhern had over-10s at his disposal was because we became adventurers there," Alern said, gritting his teeth to stifle a sob. "I'm sorry about your comrade, dear nephew. He will be avenged. If you'd like to be on the team I send, I can convince the adventurers to allow it." "No, sir. I would only be a hindrance. That beast is my exact counter, just like Kirasaka was." A fool would think this to be cowardice, but I saw it for what it was. A warrior who knew he was outmatched and responsible enough not to weigh down those who would be fighting. Little Alern had grown into a very good orc indeed. "Rezun, have Elizat gather a group of over-20s who are a good match for this thing and prepare to send them to Nulliver. Alern, you'll rest here and travel back with the group we send. Let Gluhern know that they answer directly to me, and he is to provide them with food, water, and shelter. I'll handle their pay. Understood?" "Yes, High Chief," Alern and Rezun said simultaneously. Rezun immediately set about his new task, and Alern rose from the cushion. He picked it up and put it back, like the responsible Mer I know him to be. He then turned back to me, waiting to be dismissed. "How's your father, boy?" I asked. "I wouldn't know, sir. Haven't heard from him in 2 years," he said, finally smiling. I grinned back. Agurno, my little brother, was legendarily aloof. He cared but didn't know how to show it, and simply decided it would be best if he didn't. Alern's not his only child, but since his mother has been patient enough to handle the long disappearances, he's the one who's seen the most of his father's love. Which is probably why the boy couldn't resist chuckling at his father's foibles. Well, that's good news then. If something had happened, it would have been heard across the entire continent. We both laughed at the truth of that statement. Agurno had become an adventurer instead of a chief, and quickly showed onlookers why it isn't fair for someone of my bloodline to become one. His last big fight had been against a corrupted high dragon, and it had left scars in the landscape that still haven't healed. Even his son was a powerhouse and was one of the youngest over-10s in history. If Alern had turned out to be a bit faster, that monster in Delver's wouldn't have stood a chance. We discussed the rest of Alern's family and how his career had been going. He recounted tales of fights in the wastes against gigantic beasts and funny stories involving his comrades. Then we discussed how the nation was faring, and I was careful not to go into too much detail regarding the troubles with the drow. Finally, our conversation came to a close. "I think I'll head to the chow hall. I've missed the fat-horn steak you have here," Alern said with a chuckle. "Right," I replied with a chuckle. "Oh, and Alern, I understand that the human has been adopted into the Alta family. But I'd still like to know more about it. I don't mind how this happens, whether it be an informal interrogation or if we arrange a meeting. But I don't like mysteries." "Yes, High Chief, I'll do what I can." Alern nodded and left. I rested my chin on my hand as I thought about the future of our nation. Was this human a good omen or a bad one? The latter seemed somewhat likely, considering what else had been found in that secret passage. I was distracted by this line of thought until my eyes once again rested on the mountain of paperwork on my desk. Damn. Well, back to work. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. Nick Smith. Adventurer level, not applicable, human, American. I gazed up at the lovely afternoon sky and sighed. The sun, which was shining brightly as if it were content with its existence, was floating in a sea of light blue. Puffy little clouds slowly floated by without a single care in the world. I, on the other hand, was looking up at the sky because Nash had once again planted me firmly upon my back. I heard him jump and quickly rolled. His axe buried itself into the ground where I had just been. Wooden or not, that would have hurt. I got back to my feet and time slowed down once again. He's open, and I'm mad. I activated Slide Slash and raked my sword directly across his exposed midriff, just under his belly button. I felt elation at my victory, and then a fist slamming into my forehead. Darkness clouded my vision, and I blinked a few times to clear it. Once again, I found myself involuntarily cloud-watching. It occurred to me that this was becoming a very familiar sight. I sighed as I got back onto my feet. "I think that'll about do it," Nash said, holding his stomach. "You're getting better, slowly but surely." "It's going pretty quick to me," Yulk shouted from the edge of the arena. "It's only been a couple weeks, and he's already able to land a killing blow on you." "True, but that's due to his skills rather than his skill." Nash nodded sagely. Once he saw our dumbfounded expressions, he clarified, "I mean that his knowledge of fighting is low, but his skills themselves are decent. Especially that time diminution skill." "Time dilation," I corrected. "But you're right, I need more practice." We had spent the last 2 weeks trying to unlock more skills, and so far we'd been able to get 3. Dash, power slash, and slide slash. Yulk and I had also been working on magic, which had led to me getting better at hearing that strange muffled voice as well. It announced whenever a skill had been unlocked, and my brothers had no idea what it could be. Neither of them had ever heard anything like it. They'd both been somewhat concerned when I brought it up, but they seemed to get over that concern when I revealed the latest development. Whenever I thought hard about which skills I had, a list of them would appear in a semi-transparent rectangular box. When I thought about a specific skill, it would open another box with a brief explanation of the skill. I thought of the time dilation skill, and the explanation popped up almost immediately. Time dilation 1 increases the user's speed to 150% for a very limited time. Cooldown 5 minutes. "Hey Nash, do skills level up?" I asked. "Level up? Not that I know of. You get better at using them the more you use them, though, like your muscles or your brain," he answered, pointing at his head. "It's just, when I check the status of my skills, some of them have a number 1 at the end of them," I said as Yulk walked up to us. "Which implies that the number might get larger if the right circumstances are met," Yulk interjected. "Very interesting. Which skills are you speaking of?" I pulled up my list of skills and listed off the ones with a number: time dilation, fireball, dash, earth and dagger, wind spear, and heal. "Interesting," Yulk said. "Well, with dash, the more you use it, the farther and faster you can go," Nash pointed out. "Maybe it's tracking your progress or something." "Yes, I think that's it," Yulk agreed. "Fireball, earth and dagger, and heal are similar. The more you heal people, the better you get at it. The more you use fireball, the bigger and hotter it can get. And the more you use earth and dagger, the deadlier the blade that forms." "Well, I'm still worried that nobody else seems to have anything like this," I said. My brothers looked at each other and back to me as if they didn't hear me properly. Then they started laughing uproariously. I waited for them to stop, but they kept going until tears came out of their eyes. Nash fell to the floor and started rolling. Yulk fell to his knees. After a few more moments, I lost my temper. "What the hell is so funny?" I demanded. Oh no, I'm gonna die," Yulk said between laughs. "He says he's worried," Nash shouted before falling into another laughing fit. "It's a valid concern," I shouted, making them laugh even harder. I crossed my arms and waited for them to finally collect themselves. Once they were done laughing and had got back up off the ground, I glared at them. They wiped their tears and patted the dirt off of themselves and turned back to me. "When you first mentioned the voice talking to you, I thought you might be crazy," Nash said. "Same, actually. Hearing non-existent voices is a sure sign of madness. But then you mentioned seeing the box thingies, and I knew it had to be something else. Madness takes advantage of what you know. It can't show you things that you don't know," Yulk explained. "Yeah, but what if it's... What if it's what? A trap? What the hell is there to worry about?" Nash laughed again. "If it's a trap, you're boned, boy. It's already taken hold, so the only thing to do is lean into it and hope for the best." He's right, it's a useful tool. Worrying about it is like worrying about having a whittling blade, Yulk chuckled. "Oh no, what if I cut my finger?" "Well, what if someone else finds out and tries to take it or something?" I asked. "Then we kill them," Nash said flatly, "or they kill us. No different than any other situation, really." "Indeed, there's always someone willing to take something you own. To worry about owning it would result in owning nothing," Yulk nodded. "Well, what if they kill you too and capture me to use as a lab rat?" Easier said than done, but in that case, just make yourself uncapturable, Nash sneered. How? I pleaded. Fight them with every breath and don't pull your punches. Make it clear that either they kill you or you kill them, he explained. And even if they do manage to capture you through some sort of trickery, attack them every chance you get. Make certain that they have to constantly be on their toes. It'll exhaust them eventually. Then you avenge us or join us, Yulk grinned. Before I could continue arguing, I noticed one of the orc bystanders waving to get our attention. The size of our audience had grown a lot in the last 2 weeks, and Nash had even received requests to host our training sessions at certain times of the day. Of course, he ignored these requests and simply said that training happens when it happens. I pointed out the bystander to my brothers, and they started waving us over. Wanting a break from training with Nash, I started walking over immediately. As I got closer, I noticed that the waving orc was actually Irana, the local blacksmith. Unlike most of the orc women, Irana was always fully clothed, probably due to her profession, but it's an awkward thing to ask, so I don't know for sure. She gave me a wide grin as I approached. "Hey Nick, I've got you a present," she exclaimed. She held out an object wrapped up in brown cloth. There was quiet metallic clank as I took the gift. It was about the length of my arm. Just looking at it, I thought it must be a mace, but then I noticed a small curve on one end. Excited, I unwrapped the gift and grinned when I held up the sword. It was a cutlass, like the kind that pirates use in the movies. The scabbard was made of blackened leather with brass fittings on both ends. The brass on the entrance to the scabbard had a skull and intersecting sabers, and on the other end it had crossed daggers. The handguard and hilt were also made of brass, and the handguard featured a nude woman blowing clouds from her mouth and a ship's rigging behind her. The spaces between rope and cloud were actually carved through, and the edges of these holes were sharpened. "Thank you, this is amazing." "What's the occasion?" I asked, awestruck. "Snap! It's a thank you for the entertainment that you've given us for the last couple of weeks. Watching you fight Nash and sling spells on my breaks has been great," she explained with a murmur of agreement coming from the crowd. "Well, that's out of character for you," Nash grumbled. "What happened to the miserly Irana we all know?" "Oh, I'm still miserly," she grinned. "This cutlass was commissioned by an elf, but he failed to pay in full. There's not a lot of call for cutlasses with half-basket guards around these parts. I'd have to travel to a coastal city to be able to sell it, but it's not worth it to travel that far to sell one blade. So I figured I'd free up the inventory space, show my gratitude, and give Nick one hell of a starting weapon. Win-win-win. Yeah, and I'm sure it has nothing to do with currying favor with a new adventurer, so that he prefers your shop over the much more reasonably priced shops in the village," Nash said. "You're confusing reasonably priced with cheap. The other shops get their blades from random places and people. I make my own, and they're much better than anything you'll find at those shops." She shot back. "But I can't expect someone whose intellect is rivaled by rocks to understand something like—" As they argued, I unsheathed the blade to have a look at it. The steel gleamed in the sunlight, and even with my uneducated eyes, I could tell it was well made. I turned around and gave it a few practice swings, grinning like an idiot at the swooshing sound it produced. It made me feel ready to take on anything. "Well?" Yulk asked over the sounds of Nash and Irana arguing. "I like it," I replied, practicing a punch with the handguard. "It's a really good sword." "Good to hear," Yulk grinned. "I heard that the guild lady's back. You want to go get registered?" "Yes," I said, sheathing my sword. "Well, let's go," Yulk said in a whisper. "If we hurry, Nash won't even notice we're gone." "Yes, I fucking will," Nash growled. "Where are we going?" "To the Adventurers Guild to get me registered," I answered. "Fine," Nash said, with Irana giving him a smug look. "Oh, wait, hold on. You'll be wanting to see the chief before you get registered," Irana interrupted. "We don't require his permission to get Nick registered. He's officially part of the Alta clan now," Nash argued. "You thick fuck. Just because you don't have to doesn't mean you don't have to. Or would you rather Nick have difficulty finding a first job because Gluhern's pissed at you?" She crossed her arms. "Or maybe you'd rather that first job be hunting giant rats." "Oh no," I whispered. "Why is it always rats?" "Huh?" Nash asked with a degree of hostility in his voice. "Nothing," I quickly replied, knowing he wouldn't get the joke. Let's go see the chief. There's no harm in it, right? Nash actually growled and turned away from the conversation. Losing 2 arguments in a row against Irana had to be bad for his ego. It was certainly bad for his mood. We all quietly decided to give him a few moments to calm down. Fine, he finally shouted. Fuck it, let's go see the chief. And so we did. We still got stares along the way, but some of those stares were followed by a wave. I hadn't exactly been a social butterfly, but getting dragged around by Nash and Yulk had resulted in making a few new friends, like Irana the blacksmith, Korno the chef, and Multova the merchant. When we finally got to the chief's chambers, we were told we couldn't go in immediately. Yulk and Nash shared a look of concern with each other. After 10 minutes or so, an orc rushed out without even looking at us. He was wearing a bright green bandana around his neck with 2 horses rearing away from each other on the back. He was followed by Alern, who gave us a nod as he passed. We were then ushered in to see the chief. The diabolical duo seems to have transformed into the troublesome trio. Very good timing as well, but we'll get to that. What brings you here? Chief Gluhern asked. We want to register Nick with the Adventurers Guild, Nash answered. Irana told us to see you first. Gluhern chuckled. Well, isn't this a remarkable coincidence? I was right about to send for you regarding this very issue. You want Nick to register as an adventurer because High Chief wants you to arrange a meeting between himself and Nick? Yulk asked, ducking a thrown goblet. Don't spoil my reveals, sorcerer, Gluhern shouted. Why would I have to register as an adventurer to see the High Chief? I hesitantly asked. A bunch of reasons, Nash explained. There are routes which shave weeks off of your travel time that civilians aren't allowed to use because they're dangerous. Most of the adventuring organizations can grant permits to travel these roads thanks to negotiations between them and the various governments. That's the main reason, but there's also a political aspect. Ulamak is curious about you and wants to meet you. But that's not something that a High Chief does, Gluhern added. It could be seen as an indulgence. Most of the great chiefs wouldn't care, but there are those who would use it to frame High Chief Ulamak as a layabout. That's true too, Yulk nodded. Though it would be unlikely to result in rebellion. It would be more likely that Ulamak would have to grant concessions. Okay, I understand, I said. But can I check out the dungeon before seeing the High Chief? Nash and Yulk turned to give me a look, the kind of look one gives a child who is trying to run before they can crawl. Actually, that was the plan, Gluhern said. My brother's head snapped around to look at the chief in shock. Nash started to object, but Gluhern held up a hand to stop him. Things are getting weird with the new dungeon area. The dungeon has shifted a total of 3 times since the boss has been encountered, but the hidden area and its entrance remain unchanged. We were hoping that the barrier would be able to contain the threat until the dungeon gets rid of it naturally, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Gluhern sighed. High Chief Ulamak is sending a team of over 20s to investigate the phenomena and destroy the boss. Over 20s? Yulk whistled softly. Yes. And it would be better if they could take Nick along when they perform their initial investigation. There might be things he can shed light on. I'd rather he not take part in the fight, though, Gluhern said. This isn't a time-sensitive mission, so it should be fine if you accompany them. Actually, Nash, you definitely should. You'd be able to help guide them to where you found Nick, right? Yeah, probably, Nash admitted. Good, hopefully this will shed some light on. The orcs continued discussing the plan, but I zoned out because of the blood rushing to my head. Here it was, the chance to find out more about what the hell happened to me. Even a hint might put me on the path to getting home. My mind was flooded with excitement at the possibility and dread at the thought of finding nothing. And I'll grab some charcoal and paper to do rubbings just in case. When are we setting out? Yulk asked. One of the over 20s has already arrived. The rest should be here within the next couple of days, so you'll be entering the dungeon by the end of the week, Gluhern answered. That should give you plenty of time to prepare. We're not expecting any danger, but... Better safe than sorry, Nash nodded. Understood, Chief. All right, Nick, let's go get you registered as an adventurer. Finally.